Hello YouTube. The Elder Scrolls universe is full of interesting lore and lore mysteries. For example, what happened to the Dwemer, who was Tiber Septim truly, and what's the true meaning of the writings of Vivek. But for every interesting fact and mystery that the writers of the series added, they also added a boatload of useless lore, and I've covered many of that useless lore on this channel over the years. So now I put all that lore together into this one big long form lore video for your convenience, with timestamp chapters if you want to skip a certain topic or skip this introduction, for example. So shut your brain off, as today we're taking a look back at the most useless of lore. I'm talking toilet lore, sex lore, drugs lore, grass lore, and even STD lore. So let's start with the lore on prostitution after the intro. So, prostitution, often called the world's oldest profession, is a part of almost any fantasy world in either a big or small way. The Elder Scrolls series is no exception, as nearly all the games in the series have some form of prostitution going on, from the bigger and clear examples in Daggerfall to the smaller and more vague allusions made to it in later games. Now, I singled out Daggerfall specifically there, as most of the information that we have concretely on prostitution in the Elder Scrolls universe comes from that game. You see, Daggerfall quite literally had prostitute NPCs walking around in the world, and although the player wasn't able to pay for their services, their presence in the world indicates that prostitution is very much a thing in the Elder Scrolls universe. And not only do they walk around in Daggerfall's world, but both sources from Daggerfall and the Morrowind era confirm the existence of a prostitute guild, which was officially sanctioned in the Empire by the Imperial government under the Guild Act of the year 321 of the Second Era. This act gave life to the Fighters Guild most famously, but other guilds as well, such as a Cobbler's Guild, Scribes Guild, Architects Guild, Ratcatchers Guild, and even a Prostitute Guild. Now we know that this guild was a quite large organization, specifically in the province of High Rock, because we know from in-game books that in the province of High Rock they were quite well established. The different kingdoms and city-states of High Rock all had their own chapter of the Prostitute Guild, located in buildings with rooms to retreat in with clients, and all efficiently led by a mistress who had guards to protect her girls as they worked. We know from the mostly fictional story of Princess Talara that the city of Camlorn had a particularly large chapter of the guild. This chapter was located in a large, almost palace-like building, and that in this city it was also custom for the prostitutes of the guild to take the role of dancers in large parades around the city during festivities, as they were hired by the local government to perform for the population, who then got look at them, essentially. The local government would sometimes apparently even hire prostitutes of the guild to function as a mistress to the kings, dukes and other rulers of the region. Now, in terms of the other provinces, we have precious little information, but what we do know is that by the Third Era, in at least High Rock and Morrowind, prostitution was legal. You see, in Morrowind, in the city of Sauron, and also during the Second Era in the city of Ebonheart, there are inns that are quite obviously posing as brothels in the form of Sauron's House of Earthly Delights in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, and the Ebony Flask Inn in Ebonheart in the Elder Scrolls Online. Something that we don't know, however, is whether the prostitutes working in these places in Morrowind are affiliated with the guild or not, or whether the guild even has a presence in Morrowind, considering that Morrowind has never had all the Imperial laws imposed upon it, if any, depending on the time period, because in some periods it hasn't been part of any empire. I also heard that in Valenwood, somewhere in the Elder Scrolls Online, there's also one of these brothel inns, but if it is, I wasn't able to find it, unfortunately, so take that one with a grain of salt. Apparently it's in the corner of Malabal Tor, but yeah, I didn't find any clue to that. Now, a final thing that we know is that in the Elder Scrolls universe, both men and women work as prostitutes, while in Daggerfall and Morrowind, only women can be seen, from what I have seen of the games at least. In the Elder Scrolls Online, we see both men and women working at the inns, which functions as a brothel essentially. Anyway, that's about all I can tell you about the lore on prostitution. Now, let's talk about the lore on toilets, sewers and waste management. So I've often seen posts online about the complete lack of toilets and waste management in the Elder Scrolls universe. There are whole videos online saying that the Elder Scrolls has no toilets and that Bethesda completely forgot to add them in the games, and that they you know, they know that they exist because they added them to Fallout, but just decided not to for the Elder Scrolls. And while there are many cases of Bethesda forgetting to put things into the games or being inconsequent, I'm afraid that this actually isn't one of those cases. You see, the first real flushing toilet was only invented in our own universe after 1598 and wouldn't become available to the public for a very long time. In times before that, people just had to turn to other solutions to do their business. The way things generally happened in our own universe is that people would have buckets or empty chamber pots in their homes to do their business in. They would usually then empty these chamber pots either in the rivers or canals flowing through a city, in designated landfills or pits, or in sewer systems. The toilets, if a household had any to begin with, mostly came in the form of outhouses, which needed to be emptied in rivers or sewers or landfills. There were almost no cases of toilets being directly connected to sewer systems or canals, and you might say, but Zork, didn't the Romans have a central toilet and sewer system? And you would be right and wrong at the same time. Yes, Rome was famous for its sewers, but not all of its sewers were there for the transport of human waste. A lot of the sewers actually functioned as storm drains and weren't even connected to any central toilets. However, people usually still dumped their waste into them more often than not. In the few cases of toilets actually being connected to the sewers in ancient Rome, they were usually public toilets that almost anybody could use. Richer people or nobility kept using buckets and chamber pots that weren't connected to the sewers but needed to be emptied in them separately, because the public toilets, for all terms and purposes, were extremely gross for our current day standards and even for those days standards. And they did not really help with the Roman cities' healthiness, they just were there to help with the flow of waste through bigger cities. So, with all of that taken into account, I think that it's quite logical that we don't see any real toilets in the Elder Scrolls universe, if only because they weren't widely available in our own universe until early modern times, which just isn't the period that the Elder Scrolls is based on, it's a few centuries later. So, what is human waste management like in the Elder Scrolls universe? Well, it's very similar to our own universe's past. We know that cities like the Imperial City, Arentia, Riften, Haven, Woodheart, Elenir, and Solitude all have actual sewers, and probably a lot more cities also have actual sewers. And that at least some of them are used for the management of sanitation. Loading screens in the Elder Scrolls Online tell us that especially during the time of the Riemann Empire, the Empire actively constructed sewer systems for waste management in cities like Haven, Woodheart, Elenir, and other occupied cities. In these cities, the sewer systems kept functioning and being maintained long after the Riemann Empire had fallen, as they were quite convenient and handy to use. These sewer systems don't have any toilets connected to them as far as we know, but they are rather designed for waste to be dumped into them so it can be let out of the city. This can mean that by emptying buckets or chamber pots from the surface, or by going down into the sewers manually and then dumping them into the stream when you're down there. We already know that buckets are being used to do your business in the Elder Scrolls universe, as there's countless incidents of buckets just being placed in houses and forts in very suggestive manners, which basically suggest, yeah, they're the toilets. But we know that in houses without buckets, a more elegant solution was used: chamber pots. We can find those in almost every household in Morrowind, and in Skyrim a significant amount of the houses also has empty pots in them. We have the description of a portable chamber pot in the Elder Scrolls Online, which actually literally states, "This is a chamber pot of rich earthenware, designed for the use in the great outdoors for when a tree just isn't good enough." That quote, of course, implies that, it's used to do your business in. We also know that the use of the sewers for waste management is still going on during the 4th era, as the item description of the outhouse decoration in the Elder Scrolls Blades states that, unlike some of the larger cities in the Empire, your town, that Elder Scrolls Blades plays in, lacks an underground sewage system, making the outhouse necessary. With the outhouse, of course, outputting buckets of waste which need to be dumped in either a river or in a central pit, if it functions anything like our own medieval times. So, yeah, to conclude, even though some people claim that there isn't any lore on it, it's actually pretty fleshed out, as there isn't even much left to speculation. In the larger cities, we know that sewers are actually being used for that, and that there aren't just, places for creepy people to gather. And that people have to dump their stuff manually in there. And in smaller towns, buckets or chamber pots are likely just dumped into rivers or designated pits, like in our own universe. And there you have it. Another useless topic covered. And now to get even more useless, let's talk about the lore on grass in the Elder Scrolls universe. Yeah, grass. Alright, grass. You may think there is no lore on it, but you would be very wrong about that. There isn't a lot of lore, but there is some lore, and I've tried to find it all. For one, I've been able to find 10 different types of grass which appear in the Elder Scrolls lore, although some of them are basically just weeds which people in the universe call grass, so let's start with the actual grasses. First of all, we have a type of grass which the people on Tamriel call spiky grass. It grows mainly in the colder regions and in the mountainous regions of Tamriel and has relatively short leaves. It is then to no one's surprise that this is the main type of grass variant from the lore that we can find in Skyrim, as this type of grass is able to grow in near freezing temperatures. The grass pods of spiky grass, so the pod filled with seeds which it uses to spawn more grass, are a potent alchemy ingredient, which is primarily used for poison resistance but can also be used in magicka poisons, fortify alteration potions and magicka restoration potions. As I said before, spiky grass has several different variants depending on the region. For example, in places with a lot of volcanic ash, such as the northern regions of Morrowind and the island of Solstheim, the grass leaves take on a greyish hue, while the grass pod take on a brownish hue, while slightly changing the alchemical properties of its seeds. Now, the opposite of Tamrielic spiky grass, which we find in the coldest regions of the continent, is desert grass. This type of yellowish grass we can find in the hottest and driest regions of the continent. While it looks dead due to the yellowish hue, it seems not to be just some type of dead grass, but rather it's a type of grass which adapted itself to survive on minimal water consumption. And that's basically all we know. I would speculate that it's basically a desert version of spiky grass, but we don't really know that, and there's multiple types of other grasses in the Elder Scrolls universe, so I think it's just basically its own type of grass. Now, next up is sedge grass, which is a type of grass growing mostly in high rock. This type of grass, also nicknamed tundra hay, grows mainly in high rock's mountainous regions, where it seems to have replaced spiky grass as the dominant plant type. Wild Echeteras, which are strange creatures native to northern High Rock, use this grass to graze, and some orcish recipes use it in their cooking as well. When used in cooking, orcs try to harvest sedge grass that grows close to open water, as those grass halms are more salty by nature for some reason, which brings out more flavor in their dishes. Now, next up we have another type of grass seemingly native to warmer regions. It's called swordgrass. Swordgrass seems to be primarily found in Hammerfell, but unlike desert grass, this type of grass grows in the more humid southern regions, where there's a bit more available water. The grass itself has long, stiff and sharp leaves, which seem to be sharp enough to penetrate unprotected skin under the right angle, making this type of grass quite painful to walk through without pants or shoes. The shape and the sharpness seem to also be the reason that the people of Tamriel call it swordgrass. Now, the next grass type also earned its name based on its shape, and that's the so-called red-top grass. Its defining feature, as the name suggests, is that the tips of the long grass leaves are reddish. That's basically all we know about it, except that the type of grass seems to be primarily found in Tamriel's southern, more tropical regions, like some areas in Valenwood, elsewhere, some of the more hot regions in the Somerset Isles, and also some tropical islands on the southern oceans and in the Abyssinian Sea. Now, a final type of Tamrielic grass that we know about is called foxtail grass. They are long grass halms tipped off with a long reddish-orange leaf, which kind of resembles a foxtail. We don't know much about this type of grass other than that it mainly appears in eastern and southern Morrowind. We don't know exactly why it has such a long leaf, whether that's, biologically efficient, we have no idea, other than that the leaf likely earned it its name. That's basically all we know. Alright, so next up we have two types of weed grasses. One is the Skatecrawl plant, which is classified as a grass type plant by Tamrielic alchemists, even though it looks nothing like grass. It has long and broad reddish leaves and apparently grows in ash, appearing mainly on the areas most covered by ash from the Red Mountain, like Vardenfell and Solstheim. It's quite popular with alchemists who use the insides of its stems for potions and poisons. And the second type of weed grass is called crashweed, a plant appearing primarily on the coasts of Vardenfell, as it feeds off both ash and salt water. Like Skatecrawl, it has broad, long leaves. However, these leaves are not red but green, and it has the potential to have flowers, which Skatecrawl does not seem to be able to grow. Now, these two weed plants, which are both classified as grasses, give us a pretty interesting insight into the foxtail grass that we talked about earlier, because that one also has a more broad leaf, and it also mainly appears in Morrowind, suggesting that the broad leaf might have something to do with surviving in ash. Now, both crashweed and Skatecrawl, and presumably also foxtail grass, seem to be an essential part of the Morrowind ecosystem, as they serve for food for its many native species, such as alids, which apparently eat it for sustenance. Alright, now finally we have 3 types of grass of the different planes of Oblivion and other realms. The first one is called Bloodgrass, which is native to Mehrunes Dagon's plane of Oblivion, Boethiah's plane of Oblivion and Peryite's plane of Oblivion. During the Oblivion Crisis, Tamrielic alchemists brought that grass back to Tamriel from the Deadlands, as it has quite potent alchemical properties, such as being able to provide the chameleon effect to potions, and even serve as an ingredient for curing vampirism. Now, other than Bloodgrass, we know that the Realms of Oblivion have several different types of grasses. Now, none of them who actually have a name other than Ink Grass, a type of grass growing in Apocrypha, the realm of the Daedric Prince of her knowledge, Hermaeus Mora. We know literally nothing about this type of grass, other than that it's black as ink and can technically survive on Tamriel, even though it doesn't seem to have any alchemical properties that we know of. The same goes for the so-called glow grass, a type of grass that we can find in the plane of Jode, a realm which has been suggested to be on the moon Masser, which we visit during the Northern Elsewhere main questline, The Elder Scrolls Online. Now, other than that it glows, we don't really know anything about it. No alchemical properties, no usage on Tamriel, we just know it exists. And that was basically all I can tell you about grasses on Tamriel and beyond. I hope you're happy. Because now we're going to talk about the different types of alcohol on Tamriel. And not only that, we even made some of them in real life and I had my friend Mr. Christmas taste them. He's been my guinea pig for this. So, the alcoholic beverages of Tamriel. There's quite a bit of lore on this topic, surprisingly enough. So I propose that for this video we'll first go through some of the basics around Tamriel and then example some of the most famous drinks for each of the races. So, first of all, it seems that basically almost all of the races have their own variants of beer, be it in the form of an ale, a lager, or a stout, or any other type of beer. The difference between those types being the ingredients and how they are brewed. Give it a Google if you want to know more about the differences between beer types. For example, we have both Nordic, Altmer and Breton ales, and considering almost every tavern in Tamriel seems to sell some kind of beer, we can assume that every race, so every culture, has its own beers. The same goes for wine, with basically every culture producing some form of wine, from the exquisite vineyards of the Altmer on the Somerset Isles to the rough berry wines made by the Nords. That said, while basically every race and culture makes beers and wines, there is one exception, and I will start with that exception because it's pretty interesting. The exception is the Bosmer, or the Wood Elves. They generally don't make beers, wines or any other conventional alcohol, as alcohol is generally made by fermenting or distilling plants, fruits or even vegetables in some cases. But those of you who know a bit about the Bosmer will have spotted a problem here, because a lot of the Bosmer don't eat or drink anything made from plants, at least not while they're in Valenwood. This is because of an ancient pact called the Green Pact with their god Ifre, that oversimplified means that they will not harm the plants growing in Valenwood in any way. So agriculture to farm wheat for beer or picking berries for wine is out of the question. This is called the Meat Mandate, by the way, which basically means that they can only eat meat. That being said, they did find a workaround. You see, fermenting, which is the process used to break down organic matter, like for example berries, by microbacteria in order to end up with alcohol, can technically be done with more types of organic matter than just plant-based things, even if not all are as easy to make. You know where I'm going with this. The Bosmer have themselves some absolutely horrendous sounding alcohols. Specifically, they have Jaga, which is fermented pig's milk. But if you thought that sounds disgusting, which I do, you will love hearing that one of their most common drinks is Rotmeth, which is a steaming hot brown liquid. It kind of looks like tea according to descriptions, but it's very bitter and it's a very salty drink and it's made out of fermented meat juices. I am reading this just before my dinner. I don't want to have my dinner anymore. Anyway. We also have Bosmer Ale, which they do have, but it's also made by fermenting meat, and I do not know whether it still qualifies as an ale at that point. Again, I'm not a beer expert. They also have themselves some mixes or cocktails, like the dubious Comoran Throne, which is a cocktail with both Jaga and the pig's milk thing, and Rotmeth, which is the meat juice thing. If that doesn't sound delicious to you, I don't really know what does at this point. That said, all their alcohols are so horrendous that many Bosmer which are compliant with the Green Pact are pretty jealous of other races which can just drink whatever they want, or even Bosmer that don't comply with the Green Pact. This has made it so that some Bosmers distill and ferment plants in secret. For example, some secretly ferment root clippings that make a tasty liquor, and some secretly even ferment honey as well, but their jealousy is especially strong sometimes, as some taverns in Valenwood tend to sell just any type of alcohol, but those Bosmer who follow the Green Pact simply can't buy those types of alcohol, even though they're being sold literally in their town. It's pretty sad, since the northernmost city of Arentia in Valenwood is actually known for really good red wines and high quality brandies, but those are made by the other races living in the area, such as the Imperials, who have occupied that city more often than not during the history of Valenwood. So those local products from Arentia are not made by the Bosmer themselves, but more by Imperials. That said, the reason that Arentia, the city close to Cyrodiil, specializes in red wines and brandy is again likely because of the Imperials of Cyrodiil, who occupy the city for most of its history and who specialize in wines, brandies and whiskies in the lore. Actually, almost all of southern Cyrodiil is in the lore covered in vineyards, with, at least in modern day Tamriel, the most famous wine brands being the Tamaka Westwild wines and the Surly Brothers wines. But there are far more types of wine from Cyrodiil. For example, we have the red muscat wine and the white sherry wine, and even mulled spiced wines, as actually one of the features in the Elder Scrolls cookbook, that last one. Brandies and whiskies are also commonly made in Cyrodiil. We don't know exactly where they are made, but they are some of Cyrodiil's most common export products, as most of the brandies found around Tamriel are Cyrodiilic brandy. And then the most exported type of whiskey from all around Tamriel is also from Cyrodiil, and it's called Flynn, which is originally, in the lore of the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, it was a Cyrodiilic whiskey, but now some sources state it as a Morrowind native product. It's a bit weird how they handled this, but since it originally was a Cyrodiilic product, my friend Mr. Christmas, who I said will taste some of the drinks that I'm mentioning here, has made in a Cyrodiilic fashion some whiskey by putting some grounded Cyrodiilic spices from the Elder Scrolls cookbook in a medium range whiskey. I would tell you the brand, but that gets me demonetized as advertisement for alcohol, so I won't. So Mr. Christmas, on a scale from 1 to 10, how does our version of Cyrodiilic whiskey taste?
I'm not much of a whiskey fan, so I would say a 5.
Thank you, Mr. Christmas. And with that, let us go to Hammerfell, the land of endless deserts and glittering coasts, and of course the Abyssinian Sea, which is basically the Elder Scrolls version of the Caribbean. Now, we have 3 known specialities of the Red Guards of Hammerfell. Next to regular wines and ales, which they make like everybody else, first there's alcoholic quiche, which is basically a really sweet type of Arabic coffee in our universe, so with a lot of sugar and some ginger. To my knowledge, this stuff isn't exported by the Red Guards and it's only available in Hammerfell. Anyway, I had Mr. Christmas taste this with some tasteless white liquor inserted into the quiche. So Mr. Christmas, take it away. What does it taste like? Alright.
It smells like boiling vodka. I'll try not to breathe as I do this. Oh, fuck. That's not great, I'll tell you that much, but it's not bad either.
Thank you, Mr. Christmas. I hope the next one is better. Now, next to the quiche, the Red Guards also specialize in making rum. Specifically, we know that the island of Stros Mackay, which is in the middle of the Abyssinian Sea, has quite a sizable rum export and is supposedly one of the multiple rum exporters on the entire coastal region of Hammerfell, as a lot of the coastal regions also produce this drink favored by many a pirate. Now, we could not find any specific official or fan recipes for Red Guard rum, but we could get our hands on some rum made in the Caribbean, so I had Mr. Christmas take that as the best, substitute. So, Mr. Christmas, take it away. What does it taste like? And please rate it out of 10 again.
Now, this is good. I would say 7.
Very nice. Now, the final Red Guard speciality seems to be some kind of bourbon, of which we know little else than that the Red Guards make it, but we don't know where, nor do we know to what extent they export it to other regions of Tamriel. The same goes for their whiskies, which they are also known to make, but apparently not on a very large scale, as the whiskey business is firm in Cyrodiilic hands. Now, one race that we know quite little about are the Khajiit. We know of some of their ales, we know that they have some rum production and some wine production, but their products, in terms of what stands out, is that most of them are very sweet alcohols, such as their cane mead, which is mead made from moonsugar canes. But what they seem to specialize in are cordials, which are redistillations of stuff like brandy or rum with fruit and herbs mixed in. With their cordials being very sweet, just like the other stuff that they produce. Now, next up are the Nords. We know from Skyrim that the Nords mostly specialize in mead, with an endless amount of types and local flavors existing in the lore. But the biggest two brands around the 4th era are of course Blackbriar mead and Honningbrew mead. But in the lore, something which we don't see in the games, Nords also specialize in both alcoholic and non-alcoholic ciders, which is actually quite neat. Now, Alto wine is a type of wine produced in Skyrim, which is also a Nord speciality. It deserves a special mention among the wines, as while in Skyrim in-game it really isn't all that rare, it hasn't always been the case, and there's actually a really funny story with Alto wine. You see, before Skyrim released in the lore, Alto wine was super rare due to it having special properties of being made in vineyards on lands with volcanic activities. Those lands likely being around where in Skyrim we see the geysers in Eastmarch. Now, the best brands of Alto wine were so rare and extremely expensive that the Elder Council had a sort of monopoly on it and its trade, with even the Emperor having trouble to consistently get a supply. But they did acknowledge this in the lore, because in Skyrim we can find the book An Herbalist's Guide to Skyrim, which actually tells us that the Nords found a way to make this specific type of jazzberry grapes used for Alto wine to survive in other environments than just volcanic activity environments, which made the price of the product plummet as the market suddenly got flooded with Alto wine. Pretty cool that they actually gave us an explanation for that, to be honest. So yeah, that was some pretty interesting lore, in my opinion. Now, next up are the Argonians. The Argonians are quite an interesting bunch, because they have some quite ordinary drinks, but also some really weird ones. For example, they drink Thelui, which I did not pronounce correctly probably, which is actually a quite normal drink because it's sweet rum made from sugar canes. But they also drink fermented snake sweat, snail gin, which is gin likely made with swamp snails as the name implies, and phlegmwin, which is an alcoholic beverage made with swamp gases. If that sounds disgusting, it probably is. I couldn't convince Mr. Christmas to taste something like that. Now, next to these horrendous things, we know that Argonians also make ale and wines, and likely some alcohols based on hist sap as well, but we don't exactly know anything about that. Now, we also know that Talon J, which is the Argonian bartender in Riften, actually makes mixed cocktails of sorts. Some people have linked that to the Argonians specifically liking cocktails, since Talon says that he picked up his knowledge in a bar in Blackmarsh. But I think it's more likely that mixed drinks are popular all around Tamriel and that he just learned his skills at that specific bar and just brought that bar's specialities to Skyrim, where cocktails are less popular, as we do know that Nords like more simple alcohols. That said, the Argonians also have something which is called mud nectar, which is an alcoholic drink made from rice and seaweed and likely, well, some mud, because while I don't want to kill Mr. Christmas by having him swallow mud, I did want him to taste this, so we found a fan recipe on the Tumblr page Talviel's Kitchen, which uses chocolate instead of mud, which is probably much better. So, with chocolate instead of mud, how does it taste, Mr. Christmas?
Pretty good, actually. Like, really good.
And in terms of a score out of 10?
8.
See, much better than actual mud. That said, to the viewers, do be sure to check out Talviel's Kitchen. I put a link to her Tumblr and Instagram page in the description. She made her own whole Elder Scrolls cookbook with all kind of stuff that exists in the lore, which she made recipes for. It's pretty massive and, in my opinion, a bit better than the actual Elder Scrolls cookbook, since it contains something from all around Tamriel instead of just stuff in Skyrim, some Morrowind and some Cyrodiil. So yeah, check that out. It's also made by an absolute gem of a person, as Talviel actually helped us with this video and gave advice on some recipe related things. So thank you very much, and you viewers, go check out her page. Because on that page you'll also find the next recipe, which is the recipe for Sujamma that Mr. Christmas will be tasting. With Sujamma being a very, very strong alcohol from Morrowind's Dunmer or Dark Elves. So, Mr. Christmas, how does Sujamma, one of the strongest alcohols of Tamriel, made by the Dark Elves, taste?
Also add into the video that I'm putting my life on the line for this. It's not great. It's really not great. It's like drinking a very sweet vodka drink with just a hint of the fiery tequila or whatever you call it. I'm not a tequila enthusiast.
Exactly, it tastes horrendous because the fan recipe has 4 different liquors in it. So apparently Sujamma is supposed to taste really bad in lore, so that gets reflected pretty well in this recipe. In fact, in lore, it's such a strong drink that it's one of the very few drinks that we know of that is consumed in shots in the Elder Scrolls universe. But since it only comes in single shots and is very strong, it's really one of the relatively cheapest alcohols to order on Tamriel, since it comes in such small shots. Now, other than Sujamma, the Dunmer have Sheen, which is a wine made out of comberries, and Grief, which is a brandy made out of comberries. We know that they make quite a lot of different types of brandy as well, but mostly small local brandy makers. There's no very large scale manufacturer, at least not since the first era when the 6th house was actually very famous for making types of brandy, which was supposedly quite popular, supposedly was exported all around Morrowind. Now, one of their main ingredients to create alcohol with is saltris, which is a type of ingredient which we are believed to taste like rice, or at least brown rice. As such, they have matze, which is an alcohol distilled from saltris, which is a bit comparable to our real-world sake, which I could not have Mr. Christmas drink because of an allergy. But what the Dunmer also have is rice beer, which is, well, probably similar to rice beer from our real-life world. So we did get our hands on that. So, Mr. Christmas, what does it taste like?
A bit disappointing. It tastes kind of like Budweiser, like watery. For all your American viewers, you probably shouldn't put that in there.
But we are putting it in here, because we don't like censoring people. Alright, nice. Now, next up are the High Elves. Strangely enough, we don't know an awful lot about the High Elves or the Altmer in terms of their alcohol production. We know that they produce a lot, but not exactly what they produce. We don't know that. Like, we know that they drink the alcoholic methaclin, but what exactly that alcohol is or what it can be compared to in real life, we have no idea. We do know that they definitely like their wine, and that Somerset is dotted with vineyards, producing some of the most high quality wines from across the continent, from almost every type of berry imaginable. They also produce some whiskies apparently, and we know that they produce punch, which is comparable to our own world punch, but we did not get our hands on that, so Mr. Christmas will not taste it for you. Now, finally, we have the Orcs and the Bretons left. The Orcs we really don't know too much about in terms of their specialties. We don't know that they have ales, we know that they have some form of wines, but other than that we don't know really what they do in terms of alcohol. We know that they produce Zinfandel, which is a sweet liquor made of berries and rose petals, which kind of seems out of character for the Orcs, and they produce Grog, which is a sort of beer with bittergreen in it, and they have Howl Water, which is a strong alcohol with mammoth dung in it. Amazing. Now, finally we have the Bretons, who are really nothing special in terms of alcohol. They produce wines and ales, with the only real highlight being that it seems that they are the only ones to produce port. Now, what's interesting is that the Reachmen, who are technically a different race but are usually using the Breton template in games, do have some interesting drinks that they are known for. Specifically, they have Clef, which is a drink made out of fermented sheep's milk, kind of reminding me of the Bosmer with their Jaga. But they also have some specific hard ciders made from wild apples from the Reach, which is pretty interesting. And that was basically all that we know of alcohols of Tamriel. And before we move on to the next topic of this long collection, really do check out Talviel's page. It's in the description. It's just really good. Please check her out. Alright, now it's time for us to talk about the cheeses of Tamriel. So, in general, in all of Tamriel's provinces they have different types of cheese that we literally don't have lore on and just have generic names. For example, everywhere they have blue cheeses, cheddar cheeses, marble cheeses, parmesan cheeses, goat cheeses and other cow cheeses. But I wanted to talk about some specific Elder Scrolls exclusive cheeses, and I'm starting with a cheese produced in Skyrim, Adar cheese. Now, Adar cheese is a type of blue cheese, presumably made from regular cow milk eaten by Nords, usually with meat. It has a rich, earthy flavor and creamy texture and is exported to other provinces of Tamriel, especially to High Rock, because it goes well with Breton sauces. It is said to be the best cheese in Skyrim, essentially, and some holds produce their own variants of it. For example, it's said that some variants are aged with very specific secret types of fungus in the process. A common denominator for all types of Eder cheese is that they're all aged underground in basements away from the light, and for more exclusive variants some are even aged inside vaults. Some Jarls even have their own specifically bred herd of cows that produce the highest quality of milk for the Jarl servants to make some special Eder cheese with it, only to be served in the Jarl's palace. In Solitude this is, or rather was, taken so seriously that as they make the cheese, a tiny crumb of the previous batch of cheese made is thrown into the mixture at the base of the cheese in order to create an unbroken chain of cheese going back to forgotten generations of previous Solitude Jarls. Another type of specific Eder cheese that we know of is Barrow-Ost cheese, which is made in southern Skyrim, specifically around Falkreath. It's apparently very similar to regular Eder cheese, except for the fact that it's not aged in a cellar or in a vault, but rather it's aged inside an ancient Nordic barrow atop of ancient coffins. This apparently gives it an earthy sweetness. But this does not sound tasty to me, knowing that it's basically been aged in a tomb atop of dead people, but you know, each to their own. Another type of cheese from Skyrim that basically probably everybody knows who has played Skyrim is mammoth cheese, which is apparently only made by giants because of the size of the mammoths, which, you know, regular people are unable to milk. It apparently has a robust flavor, as a Breton chef call it, but it's very nutritious. Although a lot of people around Tamriel seem to think that it's absolutely disgusting, some do like to have it in their stews. And as such, it is exported to other places around Tamriel by Nords who are brave enough to try and steal it from the mammoth, and the giants who herd them. It has apparently a very paste-like texture, and it's aged in the stomach of a slaughtered mammoth, so apparently these things that we see in Skyrim are mammoth stomachs. You know, the more you know. Now, about Skyrim, we have a lot of lore on their cheeses, as we have a whole book series in the Elder Scrolls Online, The Cheeses of Skyrim, which, well, we don't have for the other provinces, so there's going to be a lot of Skyrim here. Like, for example, we have Greenwich cheese, which is apparently almost exclusively at festivities around Morthal in the Second Era. Why only there? We don't know, but it's usually served at the end of feasts as some grand dessert, where younger members of the community tend to melt the cheese with a torch before eating it. Careful not to blacken it, as after it's melted they dip bread and apples and other fruits into it and then eat it. In some feasts that are given by the rich, it is even customary to throw an expensive amber plum into the molten cheese and then fight over who gets to eat it first, as the person who eats it first will be named king of the feast. Now, we also have Whiterun's Old Umber cheese, which isn't really cheese, but rather a mixture of cheese and cream, which is boiled until it's solid. So, yeah, the author of the book, Skyrim's Cheeses, doesn't really count it as cheese, but we're mentioning it. But let's take a quick break from Skyrim. I mean, don't worry, we will be back, as that's where most of the lore is, but let's go to Hammerfell now, because the Redguards do have one particular type of cheese which is really interesting. Shrieking cheese. Now, there seems to be nothing really special about this type of cheese in the taste department, but what we do know is that it has one weird quirk. After a secret process in which the cheese is made, it can be melted down, and when it's melted, the cheese itself screams as if in pain. Now, leave it to the Redguards to find a use out of this, as the screams of the cheese are actually used as some sort of alarm. When you throw this cheese in the cooking pot with a dish, they use the scream to know when the dish is ready. How convenient. Now, we don't know for absolute certain what kind of milk is used to make this cheese, but we do know that the Redguards like their goat milk, so it's likely that the Shrieking cheese is a variation of goat cheese. Now, that's basically all we know about Hammerfell, but what we know about another province, Cyrodiil, is, well, very little, because all we know of Cyrodiil is that they exclusively produce Olroy cheese and Colovian cheese, both of which we know nothing about, other than that they are produced in Cyrodiil. And similarly, we know that the Orcs produce Etcheteri cheese, which is made from Etcheteri milk, which we know a little bit more of because we know what kind of milk it's made from. It's made from the milk of the creature called the Etcheteri. Now, the only thing we know about this cheese, other than that, is that it functions like an aphrodisiac. Cool. You see what kind of lore we're working with outside of Skyrim? So, yeah, let's get back to Skyrim. In the Rift, they apparently make special Rift Wash cheese, which is apparently a very dry purple cheese which has a glassy violet/black exterior made from goat milk. It apparently has a very rich taste and has been bathed in blackberry mead, which gives it a really dark color, and is then shrouded in wax which is mixed with blackberry must. We also know a bit of Reachman cheese, specifically a goat's cheese which is named Doe's Ire, which sounds pretty horrid, to be honest, because it's a salty cheese that's apparently curdled in the stomach of a live baby goat, after which the baby goat is killed to then get it out. I don't like that, so let's continue with the Bretons. Now, we know that the Bretons like their cheese, but we don't know any specifics other than that they produce a lot of goat cheeses, which are known to be quite moist. That's all we know. Really scraping the barrel here of the other races, because we do have another Nord cheese that we know of. Specifically, we have Bienost cheese, which seems to be a regular cheese which is aged inside the intestines of a slaughtered pig. That's basically all we know. It's a very dry cheese and it's often eaten in spring after it's dried the entire winter, and is specifically popular in the Pale. Anyway, the final type of Nord cheese that we will talk about is called Ghost Flesh. This is a type of cheese made in northern Skyrim where the climate is too cold for goats and cows. They basically import some farmer's cheese from other parts of the province and then smoke it over a pile of burning seaweed, which gives the sea's aroma to the cheese. That way they do technically produce their own cheese in the north, even though the original base cheese was imported. So, next up we got Khajiit molten cheese, which they often make fondue with to dip other food into. Now, we know that the reason that they melt the cheese in the first place seems to be so they can throw moon sugar into the mix and often some sort of alcohol to go alongside it. But that's about all we know, as we don't really know what type of cheese they use. But you know, it's cheese lore, so you'll take it. And another piece of elsewhere cheese lore is that the Khajiit also make potatoes filled with cheese. Again, I know I'm scraping the barrel here, but we do need some variation in this video after all the Nordic talk. Now, the next piece of variation I have for you is Morrowind Scuttle, which is often called beetle cheese. It's not really cheese, but it's the Dunmer's attempt at replicating cheese, using beetle flesh and several peppery spices, like apparently pepper. It's made from flesh and not milk, and as such is considered a cheese replica, as it does not contain any dairy, but according to a Breton chef, can apparently be used as a cheese substitute in several dishes and is quite tasty despite looking absolutely disgusting. Now, the final type of cheese that I know of is shivering cheese. It's magical cheese, which glows. It's a furniture in the Elder Scrolls Online, which I'm too poor to afford in-game, so enjoy this UASP image. And that's basically all we know of cheeses of Tamriel. A bit disappointing as we have literally nothing for the Altmer, the Argonians and the Bosmer, but you know, that's just how life is. Sometimes there is no lore. But I do have a post by Tamriel, the person who runs Taste of Tamriel, who also helped me with the Alcohols of Tamriel video. That video is in the description, by the way, if you want to check it out. In this post, she made some fun headcanon cheeses, like for example Indrik cheese for the Altmer, which would make sense in lore, so, you know, check that out. It's not canon, but it's definitely lore friendly, so link is in the description. So, yeah, again, check out her page, please. But we have to move on to the next topic, Tamriel's board, dice and card games. Just keep in mind that original piece of lore was made before Tales of Tribute was made a thing in the Elder Scrolls Online. That was announced basically a month after this lore video, so it's missing from the lore video. Just know that there's another card game on Tamriel that's really popular all of a sudden in the second era, and that's Tales of Tribute. So first of all, on this subject we have a lot of information and at the same time we have very little information. Let me explain. We know a lot of different games that the people of Tamriel play, but only with a very select few of them we can actually say something about the specific rules or playstyles that go into them. That said, there are some very interesting things that we can say, so let's just start. First of all, the High Elves are basically the kings and queens of board games, since most of the culture-specific board games that we have come from their culture. Meanwhile, we've only got 1 or 2 board games associated with the other races, and in some ways, none of them are really associated with the Wood Elves. Although the Imperials and the Khajiit also have some interesting board games, and the Nords. Now, the kings of card games are the Khajiit, who are closely followed by the Dark Elves, who have a few interesting card games of their own. In terms of dice games, we know very little specific ones by name. We know that dice games are widely played across Tamriel, as we know that each race produces a variety of their own dices to play games with, but the only 2 dice games that we actually know of for sure that exist within the Elder Scrolls universe are 2 Nord drinking games. One called Deceiver's Dice, which has a travel-sized version often played in the taverns, and a game called Draugr Lich, also a Nord drinking game which we don't really know much of other than that it has some people play it with dice carved out of mammoth tusk. And it apparently has a children's version called Sheep Goat. It's really strange that these are the only two dice games that we actually got some lore on, especially since in the Elder Scrolls Online we can find many different types of dice sets associated with all the races, meaning that everybody does indeed play dice games, we just don't know any specifics. That said, we also know that some games are played universally in Tamriel, by every race, or at least nearly every race. A good example is chess, a game that we know that multiple races on Tamriel play and is presumably the same as its real-world counterpart in terms of rules and playstyles. Another example is Scrabble. Yeah, Scrabble. While not named as such in the game, in Elder Scrolls Online we can find a set of small wooden letter tiles, which in its description says that it's used to play a traditional commoner spelling game, where people make words with the tiny wooden tiles with letters on them. Also implying that even commoners on Tamriel can actually read and write, something that we already knew and we often take for granted, but it's often interesting to be reminded of, as not every fantasy universe has that, and especially not our own world in the medieval times had it. Other board games played by every race or multiple races are games that we don't really know a lot of. One is called Nine Shells, a game that, again, we don't know a lot of. We've got Checkers, which a lot of races apparently play. And the strategy game called Three Banners War, a 3-player board game in which Three Banners War is simulated. So the war that's going on during the Elder Scrolls Online. I personally imagine this to be something like three-way chess or something, but we don't really know any of the rules, only that it's played with 3 players and everybody takes a faction. In terms of card games which every race plays, we don't really know the exact names of the games or rules, other than one game called Venom Heart, of which we don't know anything but the name. What we do know is that on Tamriel there is a somewhat of a playing card industry, as there are many different sets of playing cards, such as Daedric playing cards featuring sketched images of the Daedric princes on them and their minions, but also race-specific playing cards, such as Bosmer sets of playing cards, which we know that they have the Green Lady and the Sylvanar, 2 important figures in Bosmery culture, on the back of the cards. In addition to that, we also know that over all of Tamriel we can find examples of tarot cards, some in Daedric variety and some of variety with noble houses. Now, a little disclaimer, I know nothing about tarot cards and I've never heard of people actually playing games with them, but in the Elder Scrolls Online these items are classified under games, so I assume that they're used to play games in Elder Scrolls world, and perhaps in our real world as well, but then I just haven't heard of it. That being said, those were some of the non-race specific games that we have. Most of the information that we do have lie with the culture specific games, and one interesting piece of information is that while often generic games such as chess have their sets made of wood or sometimes metal, racial specific games are often made out of materials unique to the culture or which are readily available to the culture. A good example is the Khajiit board game called Nine Holes, which is made out of carapaces of large desert insects which stride across the deserts of elsewhere. This is a good example of how cultural specific games are made with materials that the culture has easily on hand. Other examples of Khajiit board games include the game Noddy, which is a game played on a wooden board and it involves cards being laid on the board, meaning that it's a partial card game, but since it involves a game board, I'm putting it in the game board section as well. For the Khajiit we also have the game Swanstones, which is a board game which actually appears as a furniture piece in the Elder Scrolls Online, meaning that we can actually see what the game looks like, which is a rarity with most of these games. Unfortunately, as you can see on the board, I can't really make anything of this board that we can see here. Maybe any of you can put any parallels to the real world with this game, but I can't. It doesn't resemble any game that I know. The board is basically a decorated half cylinder with 2 rows of holes in it, where different shaped gemstones fit into the holes. It kinda reminds me of a Malacca board, but that game is played with multiple marbles in the holes instead of one big gemstone. If I had to guess, the game probably involves you moving your gemstones toward the other player's swan or toward your own swan, but since we don't have any rulebook of this game, it's anyone's guess how it's actually played. Now, another race that we have 2 game boards of that we can see in the game itself are the Nords. For the Nords we have this game, which is called Blood on the Snow, and it seems to be some sort of strategy game where the blue and red player take out each other's game pieces and advance on the other player's camps in the corners of the board. It kind of reminds me of the game Stratego, which we have in the real world, while at the same time it reminded my friend Mr. Dragonsneeze of the Chinese game Shang-Chi. None of them completely fits this game, but I can see where Mr. Dragonseas is coming from. And perhaps anyone in the comments can make it out what game this is actually based on. Maybe it's even sort of, I don't know, basic version of chess, but I don't know, the game pieces are too similar. Now the other Nordic game that we have as a furniture piece in the game is the Nordic board game called The Warrior and the Wolf. The rules of this game are unclear to me, but it features two main pieces, a warrior and a wolf piece, likely the two player pieces, and then three smaller pieces on each of their teams. And judging by the board we have in the game, it's likely that the two players compete over the big piece in the center. But how it's actually played is anyone's guess. It doesn't remind me of any game in real life. Other than those two games, we know of one other Nordic board game appearing in the lore, which is called Dragon's Duel, and we don't have a board for it, but apparently it's a strategy game where the players move their pieces made out of precious stones around a wooden game board and simulate battles between two branches of the dragon cult vying for power in the ancient times. Now that we have the Nordic games behind us, I think that one game which deserves a special mention in this video is a game made by the Argonians. We literally know nothing of this game, other than that it's played with a richly decorated set of carved game pieces. Now the reason that we don't know anything about this game is because the game is incomprehensible to any non-Argonians, which seems to be a trend in Argonian culture. As I semi-recently made a video on the Argonian ball game called Tiba Hetsai, which also has changing and incomprehensible rules for non-Argonians. The same thing happens when we look at the Argonian card games. One game, nicknamed Blackwood Boasts, is made out of wooden cards which apparently only Argonians know how to shuffle and to use. This means that all of the games that we know so far that Argonians created, only they can truly comprehend how to play them, which is interesting, apart from one children's game which I'll mention in a bit. That said, a far more understandable game to the people of Tamriel is not a board game at all, but it's definitely a game which also deserves a mention in this video. It's called Kick the Khajiit, and in Elder Scrolls Online we can find the rulebook to the game, which has in its description: kicking is featured prominently in this game, and it remains the only consistent feature in an otherwise arbitrary collection of guidelines. I just found this one hilarious and I thought it deserved a mention. Anyway, for the Redguards we only have one board game that we know that they play. It's called Hammergammon, and it's played with a folding wooden board. This game is obviously just backgammon. It's played with a wooden board, ivory game pieces and jade multiplier dices. The interesting thing is that another version of backgammon, presumably with slightly altered rules, is played in Morrowind by the Dunmer, where the game is called shell backgammon, where the game board, game pieces and dices are all made out of Quama egg shells and carapaces. Other than shell backgammon, the Dunmer also have a game that we actually know the way it looks, because it's another game featured in the Elder Scrolls Online as a piece of furniture. It's called Foxes and Felines. The game name kind of reminds me of Hares and Hounds in our own universe, but as you can see with this game board, it's very different to Hares and Hounds. I honestly can't make anything of this, although a friend of mine said that it might be a variation of the real world game Ludo, but it seems quite far away from that as well, so I don't know, maybe you guys have any ideas. Now, next to Foxes and Felines, we have one other Dunmer board game that we know of, which is called Valet's Conundrum. We don't know a lot about this game other than it being a puzzle game played with ebony game pieces. Now next up are the Bretons. We only have one board game of we know of that the Bretons play, which is called Traitor's Tor, a strategy game recreating the last battle in Rancer's War, on which I just so happened to have made a lore video. So, you know, maybe watch that if you want to know what Rancer's War is. We also know that the Bretons play a lot of chess, but that's something shared with basically all the other races. We also only have one Orcish board game that we know of, which is called Payback. It's played with 32 pawns, a game board and 16 onyx and 16 moonstone gemstones, which each player needs to try and steal from the other, presumably. But more than that we don't really know anything about the game. Alright, so now we only have two races left with their board games, the Imperials and the High Elves. But before we head into their board games, there's one other worthy mention. The Clockwork Apostles of Clockwork City, the students of Sotasil. They also have their own games, which are all very complicated, but one worthy mention is a dice game which doesn't have a name given to it in the game, but we can find a dice set, which kind of reminds me of Dungeons and Dragons, which is kind of fun. The idea that people play Dungeons and Dragons in Clockwork City. Anyway. Now let's talk about the Imperials, as we know several of their board games, although none of them appear in the game and none of them we have a specific rule set on. First up, we've got two strategy games, one called Battle on the High Seas, and a strategy game passed down from the Akaviri invasions and brought from Akavir called Akaviri Domination. And we've also got a game played on a board with a triangular pattern on it, which is called Strife, which we don't know any of the rules of. And finally we have a game called Diamond Duel, apparently based on an Elite ritual. This board game was likely passed down in Cyrodiil from the time that the Elite still ruled Cyrodiil, which is pretty cool. It's a bit of a shame that we don't know anything about any of those games in terms of rules, but they all seem to fit Imperial culture well in terms of theming from what I can hear from the descriptions. Now, finally we've got the High Elves, the race which has by far the most board games. To start with, we know that they play Marble Patience, or Patience, I don't really know how to pronounce this, as we can see several of those game boards scattered around Eleanor, in basically every place of relaxation and in taverns, meaning that's probably quite popular. We can't see this as a furniture piece, nor can we find it as something that we can steal or as an item with the description at all, so we don't know if it's called anything different than Marble Patience or Patience in the game universe, but they play that game, so that's fun. In addition to that, we also know that the High Elves play Chinese checkers, but in their culture it's called Punctilious Conflict, played with marbles on a star-shaped board. Yeah, this is Chinese checkers. And this one, as you can see, also appears in the game as furniture, which is very cool. The High Elves also have 4 more game boards that do not appear directly in the game, but which are mentioned only. One is a mathematical board game called Angles and Arcs, where players need to calculate complex shapes on top of their head as quickly as they can. You've also got the game Pearls of Piendene, which has hundreds of tiny crafted pieces out of wood, sea glass and pearls, which are said to be extremely complex in terms of rules and which is a really hard game to master. But other than complex and competitive games, we also got casual games for the High Elves. One is Crossstones, of which we don't know anything, and the game Where is Falanesti, which is a board game where the players take turns on a board trying to guess where the city of Falanesti is. In addition to those board games, the High Elves also have a few other games such as Crystal Column, a game of essentially Jenga, where people take crystal blocks out of a tower trying to make it not tumble over as you take your crystal. Unfortunately, most game sets seem to break after the first game, according to the description, because of course the tower falls over, and unlike wooden blocks, which we use for Jenga, crystal blocks actually break, so yeah, that's a problem. The High Elves also have the Heritage Stacking game, which is basically a stacking puzzle where pairs of ancestors need to be matched in order to create the correct family tree. They also have a card game called Towers 8, which is said to be complicated, but we don't know any of the rules of the game. And finally, the High Elves have their own version of the Spin the Bottle game, but rather than using a bottle, they use a specific type of arrow. It's said to be popular with High Elf youth at parties. One race which I haven't really mentioned so far are the Bosmer. They don't really have board, card or dice games specific to their culture, but they do have some other games specific to their culture, of which we know only 2. One is essentially darts, but it's played with darts fashioned out of deer antlers, which have been sharpened. Another game is called Perchance Acorn, a game where the Bosmer hide acorns from one another in an area dedicated to the game. So by now we have a few games left to mention, specifically card games and some miscellaneous games. Let's start with the card games, of which we all don't really know a lot. First, the Bretons, who have a card game called Pranks and Pleasures. The Dunmer have 2 known card games, one is called Shenanigans and the next is called 3-Stab Crony. Now this game, we know that the Tribunal branded the game as heretical and as illegal, since the rules and terminology of the game painted Tribunal as betrayers. Pretty interesting if I have to say so myself, but we again don't know anything else about the game. Now, the kings of card games are the Khajiit, of whom we know 3 existing card games. First we have 5 claw cards, which seem to be reminiscent of poker as it's played with coins, and a good hand is called a 5 claw flush. Another game is called 3 Moons Favor, which we don't know the rules of, but we do know that the cards feature different moon phases and a complex game is played with it. Finally, we also have that game I mentioned earlier, Noddy, which is the card game played with a game board, so it kind of fits in both categories. Now, finally we have some honorable mentions, which aren't really card, board or dice games and are also quite interesting and deserve a mention in a video like this. We've got a game by the Khajiit, it's called Regine's Dance, where a bunch of small pyramid-like shapes are scattered in an area, and blindfolded Khajiit need to find their way through without stepping on the pointed ends of the small pyramids. So basically trying to, not step on the Legos, essentially, with a blindfold. We also got the Argonian game Toad-a-lattle, where toads are being flung for an unknown purpose using a catapult-like stick. This is apparently a kid's game. And finally we have Dwarf Ball, a Nordic ball game played with a strange Dwemer sphere, where they looted the Dwemer sphere from the Dwemer ruins. It's kind of reminiscent of squash or tennis, as the balls are being smacked around with broad sticks. And that's basically all the lore on the board, dice and card games on Tamriel. So now, time to move on to the next piece of lore. Sex on Tamriel, or at least all the sexual customs around it for all the races. Let's do it. So, sex, or professionally speaking, intercourse. Just like in the real world, in the Elder Scrolls world, mortals have intercourse with one another for both pleasure and procreation. First, let's talk about procreation, as there's some info that you need to know on the biological side before we can talk about the customs. So, just like in the real world, intercourse between a male and a female of a species is used for the production of offspring of children. If you don't know the specifics, I highly recommend checking out the biology textbook, as I am your Elder Scrolls Lore YouTuber, not your sexual education teacher, but if you really aren't in the know here, I've got a visual representation for you. Right. Now, it's generally understood that any human race on Tamriel, or race of man, can procreate without issue with any other human race. So, an Imperial can procreate with Nords, Bretons and Redguards without any issues. And the general rule of thumb is that in the Elder Scrolls universe, the child will have the race of the mother. So, a female Redguard mating with a male Nord will generally result in a Redguard child most of the time, although it seems that this process is not flawless, as we have some very specific examples of cases where the race of the father resulted in child, and even some examples of half-breeds in which the child has traits of both races. But these cases are quite rare and a topic all on themselves, but the rule of thumb is that the race of the mother is the race of the child, and that generally works. Even when any of the races of elves or races of Mer procreate with one of the races of man, so the humans. It's understood that while the chances of pregnancy seem to be slightly lower in a union between a mare and a man, all races of elves, including the orcs, can very much have offspring with all races of humans. By the way, the fact that fertility seems to be a bit harder in a union between Mer and man seems to have nothing to do with the supposed lower fertility of elves, as elves are just as fertile as humans, as the chances of pregnancy in a union between any of the elvish races, so for example an Altmer and an Altmer, an Altmer and a Bosmer, seems to be similar to the chances of pregnancy in an all-human union. That being said, some elven pairings do get children very rarely, especially in High Elf or Altmer culture. But that likely has more to do with the longer lifespans and the specifics of their culture, as we see other races of elves, especially the Bosmer or the Wood Elves, proving that having children in quick succession is very much possible with an elven union. But I'm getting off track here, as we will talk about the sexual customs of both the High Elves and the Wood Elves later in this video. Anyway, back to procreation. The issue of interracial procreation gets slightly more complicated when talking about the Khajiit, as far as I'm aware we have no examples of a Khajiit union with a man or a Mer producing offspring in the games or the lore, although there are in-universe sources who claim that Khajiit are able to have children specifically with the Elvish races, or the races of Mer. This in turn strengthens the theory that the Khajiit may share a common ancestor, likely the so-called non-wandering Elmufei, with the races of elves, placing them genetically closer to the elves and the humans, explaining why Khajiit elf unions seem to be possible for producing offspring, but Khajiiti human unions are not. But the whole debate about Khajiiti origins is a whole different can of worms, not for this video, so for now it's enough to know that Khajiit are unable, as far as we know, to produce children with humans, but apparently they are able to produce offspring in very rare cases with elves. Now, finally we have the Argonians, who are just completely different biologically to any other intelligent race on Tamriel, making it so that they cannot produce children with any of the other races, as far as we know, under normal circumstances, but we'll get to that a bit later in the video when we come to the Argonians. Now, one final note on the biological aspect of procreation in the Elder Scrolls universe is that while humans, just like in our world, enter puberty and thus become fertile around the age of 12, for the Elvish races that seems to be generally slightly later, as they enter puberty and thus become fertile around the age of 19. That being said, sex in our world is not just practiced for procreation and is not just a biological subject, but is also for pleasure and for affection. Now, just like in the real world, where sex has a different place in basically any culture, this also goes for the Elder Scrolls universe. Each race has their own sexual customs and views on intercourse, so let's talk about that now for a bit. First of all, depending on an individual's beliefs, sex can have a religious connotation on Tamriel, as certain sects of the worshippers of, for example, the goddess Dibella, the goddess of love, beauty and affection, and lust, tend to use sexual activities as a part of devout worship of the goddess, and the people of Tamriel often have little shrines or amulets of Dibella in their bedrooms, supposedly to increase their sexual performance. Having intercourse as a devout follower of Dibella is, by the practitioner, seen as a way of honoring the goddess. In some circles of the worshippers of Dibella, it's even customary to wear masks during the sexual activities, so as to bestow anonymous love upon others, which is likely seen as a more pure form of worship, as the intercourse then does not have to involve direct attraction to the person that you're sleeping with, but rather is just a form of pure passion in service to Dibella. Some sects of Dibella even take this a step further by providing instructions into pleasure to the people of Tamriel. So basically sex lessons to the people of Tamriel. Now, while these lessons are described as introductions into pleasure, I can also imagine them functioning a bit like sex ed lessons, where some do's and don'ts are also described regarding stuff like STDs, which are very much a thing on Tamriel, as I discovered in this video on the STDs of Tamriel. Interesting stuff, and it really makes me question my life choices when I utter sentences like these aloud. Anyway, link to the STD video is in the description. Pretty interesting all around. Now, I need to note here that Dibella has several sects of worship, with only very few of them actually using sex as a regular method of worship. Most Dibellan religious sects do not practice intercourse as their preferred way of worship, although they do all acknowledge that Dibella is the patron goddess when it comes to intercourse, and that by practicing it you are honoring her. So it's just that a minority of Dibellan sects actually uses sex as their primary worship method. So keep that in mind, that not every temple of Dibella is just a place to have sex. That said, Dibella isn't the only deity associated with intercourse. Specifically, the Daedric prince Sanguine, the Daedric lord of lust, revelry and perversity, has sex in his domain, with some quite literally calling him the lord of unnatural sexual relations. His specific domains is that of forbidden love, taboo and perverse excesses. His followers often engage in sexual activities among one another to worship the Daedric Lord, but unlike Dibella, intercourse in the worship of Sanguine doesn't really involve love, but involves both pain and pleasure, and as I'm writing this script I realize perhaps going into further description will most likely have YouTube set the demonetization ninjas upon me, if they haven't been set out already. So yeah, knowing his is the realm of the taboo, excess, pain and pleasure, you should have enough information to ascertain the exact ways of worship that his followers employ by yourself. Now, another Daedric prince that counts sex within their domain is the Daedric prince Mephala, the Daedric prince of murder, secrets and seduction. Now, it's known that sex in groups is apparently one way to worship Mephala, and her followers and cultists often have initiation rituals which are sexual in nature. Some outsiders view cults of Mephala as debauched sex clubs, something which a cultist of Mephala confirms in a lore book. Now, in addition to that, cultists of Mephala often learn various methods of seduction and often employ it when carrying out tasks for the cult by seducing their targets. Some of Mephala's cults even have books filled with both seduction tactics and sensual arrangements for worship. Now, a final goddess that's associated with sex is Morwa, the Yokudan goddess of fertility. Like Dibella, she is associated with lust, although to a lesser extent, as her domain mainly covers the procreation aspect of intercourse instead of the pleasure side. Worship of her often centers around her breasts, and as such she is often portrayed with quite a large bosom. Now, according to the lore book Varieties of Faith, in most of her depictions she often has 4 arms instead of 2 to quote-unquote grab more husbands. Now, generally speaking, all these religious aspects of sex you can encounter all across Tamriel, with the exception of Morwa worship, who is mainly worshipped in Hammerfell. Now, these are mostly non-race or culture specific, as worshippers of these different deities can be encountered in basically every corner of Tamriel, so their specific aspects, if they belong to one of these sects, is generally found in every culture, so they might not even align with the culture that they're in terms of their view on sex. Now, incidentally, something that we also find in every corner of Tamriel is erotic art, performances and literature. According to the lore, there are countless works of arousing writing on Tamriel, with probably the most well-known example of course being The Lusty Argonian Maid, which is an erotic play meant to either be performed by erotic actors or to be read by individuals for, whatever reason. Now, in fact, back when Twitter's account of the Elder Scrolls Online roleplayed as Hermaeus Mora, the Daedric Prince of Knowledge, as a little marketing thing for the Elder Scrolls Online Necrom, they even said as Hermaeus Mora that there is so much erotic literature on Tamriel, which eventually ends up in Apocrypha, Hermaeus Mora's realm where he collects all the knowledge, that he now is just using all the erotic literature as structural support for his realm, instead of just adding it to his collection, as they are pretty much worthless to him. Now, in select houses across Tamriel, we can also find all sorts of erotic toys, which I won't describe out of demonetization fear, but just trust me that we find them all across Tamriel, and that each culture seems to be having them, like handcuffs or large tusks of things, which I won't describe what they are used for. But yeah, each culture basically has erotic literature, sex toys, and most cultures seem to also have sexual stimulants, from spells to magical artifacts to incenses, all designed to improve sexual performance. That being said, some cultures do have some peculiarities and interesting facts about them. So let's start talking about the Bretons. As we know for a fact that Breton nobility is actually quite sexually active and is seemingly even the biggest market for illegal sexually enhancing incenses and drugs. That being said, the nobility is not the only ones who are sexually active. According to an unreliable source, Breton culture in general is a bit more loose when it comes to sex than some of their other human counterparts. This can also be seen in their druid circles, as we have examples of Breton druids actually using sexually arousing magic. One such example we can even see in the Elder Scrolls Online, where a magical druid artifact makes everyone in the vicinity of an entire village basically permanently aroused and causing everyone in the area to engage in basically non-stop intercourse. Although the handling of this quest is done a bit jokingly and we never actually witness anything, of course, but just all the characters in the area are extremely forward and are permanently trying to get in each other's pants, so that was pretty fun. Apparently this artifact was originally used as a way to spice up a druidic ritual of life, which celebrated sexual unions. I mean, pretty interesting stuff, but that's all part of Breton culture. Now, one other, a bit more disturbing thing that we do know about the Bretons is that there are some mentions of inbreeding in the circles of their nobility. Just like in feudal Europe, it seems that some kings and other nobles keep it all in the family in order to secure the bloodline and keep power within the family. That being said, this doesn't seem to occur very frequently in the Elder Scrolls universe, and when we encounter it, it's mostly just unreliable sources which could have very well been fabricated to slander the lord or lady in question. But there are some indications that it actually happens in High Rock sometimes. Now, the final thing that we know is that nudity really isn't that big of a deal in High Rock. I mean, even prostitution in Breton culture is not really that big a deal. And the Prostitutions Guild of Tamriel seems to actually be doing really well and is really active in the Breton cities. In some cities even being considered a staple of the community. But I actually made a whole video on prostitution on Tamriel itself, so I suggest watching that if you wish to know more about how that's handled for each of the races and each of the nations, as I won't be covering prostitution in this video nearly as much, since this video is already really long and I don't like repeating myself. That being said, we also have sources telling us that sex and nudity is also viewed quite casually in Redguard culture, albeit in reality that this seems to differ per community and seems to be less pronounced than in High Rock, where basically everybody is really casual about it. But that's really all we know about the Redguards, other than the fact that some of the aforementioned communities, which exist all over Tamriel, likely also exist in Hammerfell, so there are Morwa worshippers there, and there are probably cultists of Sanguine and Mephala there, but yeah. By the way, the Reach, which is inhabited by the Reachmen and lies basically between High Rock, Hammerfell and Skyrim, also has some of its own sexual customs that we know very little about, other than the fact that it's apparently a great honor there to have sex with a Hagraven, so yeah. Now, a culture that we know a little bit more about, but still not a whole lot, is Imperial culture. Now, we know that in Cyrodiil people are a bit less casual about sex and nudity than in Hammerfell and High Rock, but here as well it's definitely not frowned upon in general. I mean, Imperials will generally just bring it up less naturally in conversations than, say, a Breton. That being said, we know that just like High Rock, Cyrodiil is a very profitable area for the Prostitutes Guild apparently, and the Bella is described as Cyrodiil's most popular god, with there apparently being quite some cults dedicated to her in lore. Again, not all of them are likely about having sex to worship, but there's probably some. And it seems that Imperial soldiers are allowed to bring erotic etchings with them in their personal belongings while far from home, as we can find one of those in ESO's contraband loot items. We also know that Hearts Day, which is this holiday celebrating love across Tamriel, seems to be an Imperial invention, or at least became mainstream in the Cyrodiilic empires and then spread over Tamriel. And during the days of the Third Cyrodiilic Empire, it was customary for inns to give free bedrooms to couples on Hearts Day, so yeah, cool. So next up are the Nords, and for the Nords, well, we know that they are less open than the Bretons and Imperials and Redguards when it comes to sex, with game examples showing us that people seem especially to disapprove of devout Debella worship by having intercourse instead of like honoring a shrine. That being said, sex seems to be really a behind closed doors topic within most Nordic communities, making them as such the most conservative and least casual human race as far as we can tell. The interesting thing is that we do have one example of a Nordic army in the Elder Scrolls Online employing a so-called morale officer, who is basically a prostitute traveling with the army to keep the soldiers' morale high. That was actually a first for me when I saw that, but you know, maybe after this video I might see it modded into Skyrim by someone somewhere. You know who you are if you're watching. Anyway, let's move on to the Elvish cultures, as generally we have more lore on them than on the human races. Let's start with the Bosmer, or Wood Elves, who are said to be very casual when it comes to sex, even more so than the Bretons. We have multiple examples where Bosmer specifically, including the Green Lady and the Sylvanar, who are, let's say, a really important set of figures in the Bosmer culture, to put it very mildly, just casually bringing it up and saying that they'd rather be doing sex than the thing that they are doing at the moment. It's also implied that in Bosmer marriages it's quite acceptable to just keep seeing people on the side. Not all Bosmer, of course, but it seems quite normal in Valenwood to have multiple partners. And on top of that, Bosmer families often get an average of 12 children in a family. Even their religion and their myths tend to contain way more sexual themes than they do in most other cultures, often drawing their deities in erotic manners. So yeah, definitely more relaxed about that part of life, especially when compared to, for example, the Altmer or the High Elves, who may as well be the most uptight and conservative race when it comes to sex. That's because at least traditionally oriented Altmer, of whom there are quite a lot according to the lore, are obsessed with bloodline and the purity of the offspring's race. Again, this does not mean that all High Elves are that way, a lot aren't, but in lore a lot of them are as well. In some very conservative Altmer circles, eugenics are apparently practiced, where if a child has deformities or traces of non-Altmer blood in them, they are labelled as Hulkins and are generally thrown out of the family as babies to either die or to be erased by the temples, and in some extreme circles these children are straight up killed by their families after coming into the world. Pretty dark stuff. I mean, these circles of Altmer society are so obsessed with their purity that even having sex with a Bosmer or a human can be compared to bestiality to them, and marrying a non-high elf can be enough to be just completely disowned in those circles. While, for example, inbreeding, while slightly frowned upon, is probably even preferable to marrying a non-Altmer in those circles. So especially in those circles, just casually having sex with someone is just very much frowned upon, and in Altmer society in general, it isn't an often openly discussed topic, with it being very much a private matter for the couple in question. Now, this whole eugenics business is often brought up in the lore community as a reason as to why the Altmer seem to have such a low procreation rate. Altmer couples who have a very long lifespan and are often together for long periods of time, I mean we're often talking about centuries here, tend to only have 1 to 3 children, with 2 being the average. But I have to say, eugenics being the reason for that is quite unlikely in my opinion. You see, it's only a part of the Altmer population who is so extreme about this purity, and not only that, but the whole idea that Altmer have a lower fertility than humans and other types of elves also seems to mostly be untrue, as when an Altmer has a relationship with a human or Bosmer, the amount of children on average seems to be much higher. But I do have a very interesting speculative explanation for the low birth rate among Altmer. You see, as I've talked about in my video on love and marriage customs on Tamriel, link in the description if you haven't seen it, Altmer often engage in strategic and political marriages, especially in the higher and more conservative circles. This means that essentially, in a lot of marriages, these marriages are just loveless between the partners, and thus it would make very much sense if intercourse does not occur all that often in these marriages. On top of that, traditional Altmer tend to very much conform to the norms of society, so if the norm is 2 children, they may not necessarily want to have more, so they don't have to stand out in society and become a pariah in their community. This leads to some very interesting speculation that perhaps the Altmer, by far the most advanced culture in terms of magic, may have developed some form of magical birth control, perhaps in the form of a spell or a potion, meaning that even in loving marriages they can consciously keep the amount of children at bay, and in a loveless marriage they can secretly see as many lovers on the side as they want without producing any offspring. As producing offspring outside of marriage, especially in the more traditional circles, is likely very shameful, and again probably enough to be disowned and kicked from the family, so that would make sense. Now let's move on to the Dark Elves, or the Dunmer. They are very similar to the Altmer, albeit multiple gradations less extreme than with the traditional Altmer. Sex is a topic that you don't really bring up in conversation in Dunmer society. It's a subject for behind closed doors, which you don't bring up and in some cases are even expected to lie about. For example, oral sex and sex through the back door, so to say, monetization, was forbidden under tribunal law in Morrowind, but almost everyone does it anyway. You're just expected not to bring it up and deny it if some form of law enforcement asks, which they never do. This creates this interesting duality, that outside the house Dunmer are generally very reserved and restrained and don't talk all that much about intercourse, while indoors the Dunmer have a reputation for being one of the more promiscuous cultures. Brothels are quite a common sight in Morrowind, but you don't talk about them, and from the outside they don't look like it. The religious works of the Dunmer, especially the Lessons of Vivec, have overtly sexual themes to them, but you don't talk about that on the street. They have quite a lot of erotic literature compared to the other races, but people are likely expected to say that they don't have copies and I don't know where I got it, that kind of thing. That being said, the traditional Dunmer are also quite serious about the whole purity thing. In some of the traditionalist circles it's considered heresy to mate or marry with a non-Dunmer, although it doesn't seem as extreme as the Altmer traditionalist, and they don't tend to practice eugenics as far as we know. Now, one bit of extra information that we have on the Dunmer is that it seems that they are, just like the High Elves, very conservative when it comes to the amount of children that they get. They too come in at an average of about 2 children, while their lifespans are very long, in some cases longer than that of the High Elves, so their population growth should equally be lower comparatively. Now, next up are the Orcs, or the Orsimer. Now, we don't know all that much about the sexual customs of the Orcs, other than that in traditional Orcish communities in the strongholds, only the chief is allowed to have the intercourse and reproduce according to the Code of Malakath. The chief therefore has many sexual partners, while the other male orcs in the strongholds are supposed to have none, although it's heavily implied that in especially bigger Orcish communities there are many unmarried or unofficially married couples behind closed doors. Now, furthermore, orcs who do not follow the Code of Malakath and rather worship the god Trinimag completely disregard the whole only the chief may have sexual partners thing and straight up just get married to whomever they want. One additional piece of information on Orcish sexual customs is that they have quite a few foods which they consider to be aphrodisiacs, which they consume before intercourse, while at the same time, as far as I could find, they are one of the races with the least amount of actual stimulants in the forms of drugs and incenses as are described to them, so that's nice for them. Alright, next up, the Khajiit. The Khajiit are quite an interesting bunch. For one, multiple sources describe the Khajiit as having barbed penises, making intercourse with Khajiit extremely painful for any non-Khajiit, and presumably also painful for other Khajiit. Now, second, they are one of the races which we actually know that they produce quite some pornographic items in terms of art and literature. They have a reputation for being quite promiscuous and pretty open about sex, which they call zoop zoop, by the way, in case you wanted to know. Now, in addition to their pretty open and casual attitude to sex, we know that the Khajiit are one of the races, together with the Bosmer and in some aspects the Argonians, who really just don't mind seeing other people on the side next to their partner. And yeah, they are one of the few races in which group-based intercourse is actually seen as pretty normal, apparently. So yeah, good stuff. One interesting thing here though is that since sex is also meant for procreation and not just for pleasure, I would think that the Khajiit likely time their sexual escapades consciously. Let me explain. There are many different types of Khajiit in the Elder Scrolls universe, and which type a baby Khajiit becomes is dependent on the stance of the moons during their birth. This determines everything about the type of Khajiit that they will become, from a small house cat-like Alfiq Khajiit to the large and mighty Sencharat. I would think that Khajiiti parents, considering the stances of the moons are predictable, would be able to time their time of intercourse in a way where they would be able to get the type of Khajiit child that they want. So it's possible that some Khajiit do that, but we have no actual confirmation of that, so it's just speculation from my side. But if you do want to know more about every type of Khajiit that we have and which stances of the moon lead to their births, be sure to check out my video on every type of Khajiit and the stances of the moon that they are conceived in, it's in the description of this video. Alright, final race and culture are the Argonians. Now, the Argonians are quite an interesting race, in the sense that they are completely different biologically from all other of Tamriel's races. They were created by the Histries as their servants and protectors, and as such they are not descendants of the Almophae, or the original ones, which are said to be the far-off ancestor of every intelligent race on Tamriel. They are completely incompatible to procreate with any other race than themselves, with no offspring ever being recorded to naturally exist between an Argonian and another race on Tamriel. The only one we have is one couple in the Shivering Isles where it's told that Sheogorath himself, so a god, had to intervene to even make it possible, so no natural compatibility between the races and Argonians. But it is possible with some very heavy meddling of a god. That being said, Argonians were modeled after humanoids, and they have even been given sexual reproduction organs by the Hist, making it possible for them to have sex with any race on Tamriel. It just won't produce offspring. I'll give you one better even. While in general Argonians lay eggs as their method of reproduction, having eggs hatched by the Histries in their hatching pools, generally, the Hist have given Argonian females all the organs required for procreation as mammals, since the Hist can actually make it so that the Argonians can carry their own children and feed them themselves in periods of crisis where their hatching pools are not safe. This is why Argonian females have breasts, by the way. Now, even more interesting than this is that Argonian sex, so between two Argonians, generally doesn't lead to procreation and eggs being created, leading them to be quite casual about sexual pleasure in their relationships, as the only way to actually procreate seems to be mating in blessings of the Hist, which is actually done with elaborate rituals to find the strongest Argonians in combination who will get the best offspring when they mate together. This means that Argonians usually mate and get children with people of whom they are far from interested in romantically and usually don't even know. Again, there are exceptions to these kind of rules and traditions, as with all of the previously spoken about cultures, but it's pretty interesting. I actually described this ritual finding a mate in some detail in my video on marriage and love customs, again link in the description if you want to take a look. Now, one final interesting tidbit is that procreation is meant to be done under the watchful eye of the Hist. Then why is it so that Argonians have a sex drive at all outside of that ritual? Like, why were they designed by the Hist to actually want to do it for pleasure? I mean, just like the other races, we have examples of Argonian erotica in literature and art. So, yeah, pretty weird. And pretty interesting. And that was basically all I can tell you about sex on Tamriel. However, there is one more little thing that we do need to talk about, and I am going into my sexual education teacher role here. STDs on Tamriel. Watch out. Alright, so to start with, for those who don't know out there, an STD is a certain disease that you can obtain through one or more unprotected sexual acts. In our world we would be talking about diseases such as AIDS, which comes through the HIV virus, and stuff like chlamydia. As you probably suspected the moment that you clicked this video, there isn't a lot on this topic, which is why I made this video a little extra video in between my regular upload schedule, so I can do a regular video coming Thursday. That said, I was very surprised to hear that there is in fact lore into these subjects, so let me show you what I found. Now, most of the lore that we have around the topic of STDs in Tamriel is only slightly hinted at for obvious reasons. It's in sort of Easter egg, so to speak. However, there is one very interesting quote in the book The Wolf Queen, specifically in volume 4. Here someone describes the then Emperor Antiochus Septim by saying the following. Antiochus Septim had impressed his subjects with little but the enormity of his lust for carnal pleasures, and he was enormously fat and marked by every venereal disease known to the healers. Antiochus spent little time on politics. This quote specifically mentions the existence of venereal diseases, which is more or less a synonym for sexually transmitted diseases, so STDs, meaning that they do exist in the Elder Scrolls universe. Now, in terms of what exact diseases are sexually transmittable in the Elder Scrolls universe, we don't quite know. However, there are several diseases that we can speculate on quite good grounds that they can be spread that way. Now, the most prominent example that people will probably first think about when hearing this would be the different diseases that are vampirism. So, for example, sanguine vampiris. Pureblood vampires, for example, are infected in a ritual with Molag Bal, which is sexual in nature, and a lot of people seem to agree that the infected humans can in fact spread the vampiric gift in that way too. It seems logical, however, the problem is that we have no direct confirmation of this ever happening, for obvious reasons, as, you know, Bethesda usually just say, well, they got infected, and they don't really say how, and it's basically suspected that most got infected through a bite. However, this could be a way that it's transmitted as well between humans, instead of it only being the way for Daedra plus humans. So in the case of Molech Ball and the infection of pure vampires. The same case goes for the Corpus disease, or the Blight as it's called in Morrowind. It's said to be very contagious and that one can actually contract it through another person's fluids, so that way I would suspect, and I would speculate, that that too is transmittable in this way. However, for that too, we don't have any concrete written examples of it ever happening that way. Now, there is another disease named Ticklebirch, which is contracted using a hoe in Oblivion. You get it? Using a hoe. Now that's most likely a way by the developers to pun on the way on how one would actually get the disease in lore. When you use the hoe, you get the disease yourself, and people you hit using the hoe also have a 40% chance of contracting it. As I said before, this is most likely a joke by the developers, but it seemed too clear of a play on words not to mention it here, as I think that if this disease actually exists within lore, I mean, you wouldn't get it by using an actual hoe like the tool. This is probably a play on words on how people actually get it in the Elder Scrolls universe. And that is basically all we know. However, there's one more little thing present. In Harani's report in the Elder Scrolls Online, there's a sort of slight reference to a man who had sold ointments against a form of syphilis, because the old name of syphilis is pox, and that which is directly referenced in that little note. And that was everything, admittedly the very little bit of information that I could find on STDs, but still, it's good to talk about, because you guys need to be educated. That being said, now let's talk about something that we do have quite some lore on, the sports of Tamriel. Alright, so sports. I'm going to be broad today and not just include physical sports like ball games, but also include other activities that the people of Tamriel consider to be sports, like the aforementioned frog races that the Altmer are holding. They are a seemingly favorite pastime of many Altmer, and while not strictly a sport since there's no physical activity for the High Elf participants, they themselves call the frog races a sport, and the Altmer are pretty fanatic about it. They bet on races, and there's a small industry of frog breeders who use special foods, alteration magic and other techniques to make the frogs faster. There doesn't really seem to be a limit as to what you can do with the frogs as long as it's a frog and it's fast. The same actually goes for lizard races in Hammerfell. It's much the same concept, except the tracks are bigger and it's way cooler, as you can see. Right, anyway, in some parts of Hammerfell people take it even more seriously than the High Elves do their frog races, as there's an even bigger betting scene and even some organized crime that apparently gets involved in the lizard racing scene. There are organizations and merchants breeding special race lizards in the lore, some with good reputations, making good fast lizards, and some with bad reputations, making them purposefully slow apparently. Alright, now having covered the absolutely most awesome sports, it's time to talk about some sports that people actually play themselves, you know, put some physical effort in. Well, first of all, we basically know that all around Tamriel we have competitive fighting arenas. These arenas tend to come in all shapes and sizes, some with special rule sets, some are gladiator on gladiator, and some are gladiator against monsters or animals. The tradition seems to have started with the Cyrodiilic empires who spread the tradition of arena fights around the continent. However, blood sports have always been a part of most cultures on Tamriel, so while an established arena system may have in large part come from Imperial culture, there's some evidence of older civilizations having blood sport as well. They may have been organized, and if they were, well, we just don't know about it. That being said, we do know that the Bretons actually have jousting as one of their sports. Jousting is one of the sports which the Breton noble houses and knightly orders practice to compete against one another in peaceful yet competitive activities. Although people obviously sometimes die in accidents, it's not nearly as bloody as full-scale war between noble houses. Now, the jousting that the Bretons actually partake in seems to be a carbon copy of real-world medieval jousting, at least in the way it's portrayed in most popular media. So, two knights riding a horse along a fence in opposite directions and try to joust each other off the horse using long jousting spears and protecting themselves with their shield and armor. Other than that, we don't really know that much about jousting in the Elder Scrolls universe, considering that it's something that only recently explored by the Elder Scrolls Online's High Isle expansion, and that game's horse riding mechanics don't really allow for jousting by players. So yeah, we don't really know that much about it. That said, we do know of another sport using horses in the Elder Scrolls universe: horse racing. Now, we have precious little lore on actual horse racing. While jousting has recently been added pretty prominently, horse racing doesn't really have a lot of lore to it. It does seem to exist in the lore based on some offhand mentions, but it's never been truly explored in depth. The most likely reason for this is probably similar to the reason for jousting going mostly unexplored, so game mechanics. Horses in the Elder Scrolls games have usually had a single speed and not all that great controls for something like racing. While in the Elder Scrolls Online speed per horse does vary, other factors like horse movement and controls wouldn't allow for particularly good racing in that game either. So it's likely that that is why the developers of the series have probably kept horse racing out of the games and thus likely not creating very robust lore around it in order to not draw attention to the fact that it's missing. Alright, so next up is an original orcish sport called Voshbal, which is basically extremely violent dodgeball, and I love it. I once made a video on it already, so for more information about Voshbal, be sure to check that video out. But still, not exploring Voshbal in this video would be kind of a shame, as it's a really cool sport. So, since I don't like repeating myself, allow me to bring in my YouTube colleague Burnetch, who makes amazing Elder Scrolls audiobooks and has done a really large part of the in-game book catalog. So I asked him to come on and read the primary source that we have on Voshbal, the lore book The Sport of Clans. So, Mr. Burnetch, take it away.
The Sport of Clans. A description of a traditional orcish sport. Voshbal has a long and fabled history, going back to the earliest days of the Orzamer people. As the orcs gathered into clans, they developed the concept of courage ball. It started not as a sport or recreational pastime, but as a way to test the bravery and resilience of clan warriors. The earliest forms of Voshbal utilized a heavy sphere made of wood or metal that was about the size of an orc's head. The novice warrior to be tested stood on the far end of a paced-off court, staring down a battery of veteran warriors, each armed with a Voshbal. The veterans would each toss their Voshbal in turn, hurling it with as much strength as they could muster. If the novice was still standing after the volley of heavy missiles subsided, they proved their courage and was promoted higher into the warrior ranks. As time went on, the test became an organized sport, with teams competing for honor and recognition among the clans. The heavy metal ball was replaced with a heavy leather ball, and rules and regulations were formalized and agreed to among the participating clans. Today, no gathering of clans is complete without a rousing, multiple-day Voshbal contest. Foreign clans hold the current record for ongoing victories, winning the last 7 series of the clans by wide margins. Chief Bazrak of Farron, the Farron's most valuable player, has a particularly nasty and powerful toss he affectionately refers to as the Bonebreaker. While the rules of Voshbal are constantly changing, the basic structure of the game remains the same. 2 teams of 6 orcs each, all armed with a sling of free Voshballs, competes to control the enclosed court by rendering their opponents unconscious by hurling the heavy spheres with all of their might. Beyond that, there are dozens of rules and regulations that non-orcs find confusing and contradictory. No matter. Anyone who has ever witnessed the game played in all its glory comes away excited, breathless, and with a renewed understanding of the definition of courage.
Alright, thank you for that nice little audiobook. I can really recommend you guys checking out Burnetch's channel. He makes extremely high quality little Elder Scrolls audiobooks for the lore books that we find in the games. Listening to his videos is just such a fun experience, and you can learn a lot about the primary sources of Elder Scrolls lore that way, so please give him a visit. I will promise that you will not be disappointed. A link to his channel and some of his best work is in the top of the description. Alright, let's talk about some more sports now, because we have some Argonian sports coming up. We know that the Argonians have at least 3 sports, and they are called Tiba Inu, Tiba Basu, and Tiba Hatsai. Now, I have covered Tiba Hatsai in a past separate video where I explained some more of the rules, so I recommend you watch that for more in-depth information. But in short, Tiba Hatsai directly translates to hip and tail ball. It's a sport where Argonians are only allowed to touch the ball with their hips, tails, and elbows. Any other limbs touching the ball is not allowed. Because of this, Argonians with bigger and broader tails are usually among the best players of the game. The game itself is played on a large muddy field by 2 teams of 5 Argonians, with a wall on each side of the field and hoops suspended over the field. When a ball is tossed up, players can use their tails and hips and elbows to pass to other players and try to hit the opposing side's wall. When the ball is hit, they get a point. They can get more points depending on the circumstances of the hit. For example, hitting the wall after sending the ball through a hoop gets you 3 points, a hit on the wall while it rains gets you 2 points, and the game is ended either when one team has 10 points or if a specific hoop over the field is hit. It's a pretty hard sport as the balls that are used are heavy, and getting hit by the balls is not a particularly fun time, so weaker Argonians and outsiders usually use protective padded armor or special lighter balls. I made a video explaining the game in more depth, plus the similarities to a certain Mayan game in that video that you see on screen, which can be found in the description for more information, so consider watching that after this if you want to know more about hip and tail ball. Because here we have even more Argonian sports to cover. First of all, Tiba Inu, which is a game that is also played with a ball, but nobody really understands the rules properly, or at least nobody that's not an Argonian, because it's partially a sport and partially an Argonian ritual, for which the rules are extremely convoluted and unclear. No Argonian has ever read the rules for it, and yet they just seem to know the rules instinctively. While outsiders observing it cannot seem to make sense of it, no matter how hard the Argonians try to explain it, a Breton who once tried to document the rules descended into madness while trying. To give a little bit of an idea of what the game plays like, Argonians in seemingly random order lay down in the mud, slap their tails, kick many balls towards the other team at the same time. They randomly do war cries, which seem to be a part of the game and not just provocation for the other team. They sing as part of the game, and sometimes they completely ignore the balls and just roll around in the mud with the other team, and that somehow gets them points. It's not for us to understand, I think. It's just a strange game. Now, the final Argonian game that we know of is called Tiba Basu, which seems to be a form of tennis or racquetball, as it uses smaller balls and rackets. But that's basically all we know. There's really no more lore on it except that bit. And that goes for most of the other sports in this video as well, because there are now a few more sports to be covered. None of them have a lot of lore to them, but some do call to the imagination and have parallels to sports existing in our own world. So, first of all, we know that the Nords, and presumably other races as well who live closer to rivers, race rowboats down the rivers, both solo and in teams. You also have Mammoth Ball, which is a game that the Nords tend to play. We know nothing about it other than that it's played with a grapefruit-sized ball made out of mammoth leather, which still has the mammoth hair on it. The long hairs of the ball may have gameplay purposes, but if it doesn't, then I don't know why you would keep the hair, to be honest, but it's not for us to know because there's not much lore on it. We know that the Red Guards play a form of bowling. We know that the Khajiit have a game called Spike Ball, played with spiked balls, which they take quite seriously apparently. There's also several water-based sports, not specifically tied to any race or culture, which uses a discus. And we have the Orcish game called Gulob, which is an extremely violent game played with sticks, presumably to hit each other, but we don't know, unfortunately. You see, of all those sports, we know that they exist, but we know very little else about them, since we only have 1 or 2 lines of lore on them, and usually therefore we only know the name of the sport and maybe 1 or 2 characteristics. Just like with Tamriel's board, dice and card games, on which we also know a lot of games, but we know the rules to only a very few. I made a video on that as well, and you'll see there that there's a few board, dice, card games that we know rules to, just like with sports, but most of them we just know the name. But, you know, just in case you want to continue watching more of my videos, check out that link in the description. And if you're sick of my voice or want to watch some actual quality content for once, check out Burnetch's Elder Scrolls audiobooks. A link to his channel is in the description. Please check him out. Again, he does really cool work and he's really underrated, so check out the link in the description. Alright, now instead of sports, let's talk about something quite a bit different, the beauty standards on Tamriel. So first of all, I want to make clear that what is considered beautiful is really a subjective, personal thing. Now, for example, we have NPCs in the games which really don't adhere to the beauty standards for their cultures, and yet their partner or the person crushing on them is absolutely smitten by their looks. So don't think of this video as how your character needs to look to be attractive, as that's a whole different discussion. Rather, think of this video as a general discussion on what kind of physical attributes are appreciated or are considered beautiful, handsome, sexy by the mainstream masses of a certain culture. Alright, that being said, something which we can basically say about all the races is that in their culture the attributes of a healthy and clean body seem to be generally appreciated. For example, people with disease-ridden skin, for example corpus disease marks on one's skin, are regarded as less attractive than those with a clean, even skin tone. From some NPC dialogue we can also discern that while weight is not really something the people on Tamriel care about, either too thin or too fat people do seem to be considered less attractive by the masses. And finally, something that I can say about all the races with some certainty is that clean teeth also seem to be appreciated in almost every culture, as most cultures seem to have some popular objects to clean your teeth with. But that is about all that I can say about the general population of Tamriel, as each culture seems to have their own standards to a degree. Now, we don't know as much about each of the races as I would personally have liked. For example, most human races we know very little concrete information about, while with the elves and the beast races we generally have a bit more. So let's start with the human races. While most human races seem to appreciate a healthy looking person, the exact specifications of what's considered to be healthy can vary. For example, we know that in Nordic culture being a sturdy and strong person is considered very attractive. Both men and women with tall, muscled physique tend to be regarded as attractive, while slim and short people are considered to be less so. For both men and women, long hair seems to be the preference, with both men and women braiding their hair, but especially women. Now, beards are considered almost a must for a man in Nordic culture, as they add to the sturdy and strong image. And generally the Nords seem to prefer the people to be more natural in terms of their bodies and don't really care about stuff like body hair. For example, ear and nose hair seem to be somewhat appreciated by the Nords, as it adds to the sturdiness and naturalness, like with beards. Now, the Bretons and the Imperial seem to be the complete opposite of that, seemingly preferring women to be shorter and less muscled. A muscled physique for men does seem to be appreciated, but not in the same way as the Nords. I mean, height doesn't really seem to matter as much, and personal grooming is an absolute must, especially with the Bretons. I mean, nose hair is just a no-go it seems, and if you must have a beard, then Imperials and Bretons appreciate regular trimming and cleaning. Many Imperial and Breton NPCs also seem to consider dark hair to be a bit more attractive than blonde hair, while the Nords don't really seem to care about your hair color. Now, a final thing about the Imperials specifically is that in women they do seem to appreciate a slim physique and long hair, as the statues and depictions of the beauty ideal, the goddess of beauty and sexual attraction, the Bella, in those statues she is always portrayed as having a slim figure and long hair, and the depictions of her that we see are almost always the Imperial depictions of the goddess, so that's why I say it. Now, for the Redguards, their goddess of beauty and fertility, Morwa, is usually depicted with large breasts, and considering the focus on her bosom in her worship, there's a good chance that in Redguard culture larger breasts are considered to be more beautiful. Although we don't have any lore which explicitly states it to be so, just like with the Debella statue conclusion with the Imperials. Now, what we do know for sure is that the Redguards actually put a bigger emphasis on hairstyling than the other cultures, for both men and women. Elaborate hair braids and dreadlocks are deeply ingrained in the culture and are considered quite attractive, regardless of their hair length. They, just like the Bretons and the Imperials, also seem to appreciate personal grooming. For example, untrimmed nails are considered quite unattractive, and beards also need to be trimmed regularly. Now, one other thing I found is that rather than black eyeshadow, Redguard women with bronzish eyeshadow seem to be considered more attractive than those with black or blue or any other color of eyeshadow. Alright, next up, let's talk about the orcs. We know very little about the orcs, other than that we know that they really appreciate tusk grooming. So, clean tusks which have been sharpened and even shined. Now, there are multiple brands of tusk shine that we can find in the Elder Scrolls Online's contraband, and by far the funniest one is called Uncle Brooks tusk shine, but it's far from the only one, like there are multiple. But other than that, just like the Nords, they seem to appreciate a sturdy physique most of the time, with muscles for both men and women being somewhat of an ideal. But other than that, and just the groomed tusks, we really just don't know anything about the orcs. Now, a culture that we also don't know that much about are the Bosmer. We know exactly 3 things, at least from what I could find. They find sharp and pointy teeth very attractive, so more animal-like teeth. They tend to find tiger and cat-like eyeshadow very attractive, and they also really like horns. It's a bit unclear how Bosmer horns work. Some sources claim they are all cosmetic additions made from creatures that the Bosmer hunted, or magically grown to make them more bestial, while other sources claim that some Bosmer are actually born with horns, so we don't really know how that works. But regardless of how it works, fake horns or not fake horns, Bosmer really find horns to be very attractive. And concluding on this, I think it can straight up be said that the Bosmer tend to appreciate a more bestial form. But other than that, we don't really know all that much. But I suppose that just like the Nords, they most likely enjoy someone's body to be more natural rather than very cosmetic, since they are going for the whole bestial thing. Alright, so next up are the Dark Elves, or the Dunmer. We know a bit more about them. For example, it seems that smooth skin is considered more attractive than the uneven skin that some Dark Elves are born with. They seem to be the only race to actively make skin cream for smooth skin, which is actually pretty interesting. And personal grooming is an absolute must. Body hair seems to be looked down upon very much. Nails need to be trimmed. Beards, if you must have them, need to be regularly maintained. And they're also one of the primary users of lip paint, so essentially lipstick. It also seems that natural red hair among the Dunmer seems to be considered more attractive than dark or either white hair. Now, if you were somewhat disappointed so far about the amount of lore that we have, let me assure you that the final 3 races either have more lore to them or have quite interesting lore when it comes to beauty standards. So first let's finish talking about the elven races with the Altmer, or the High Elves. Traditionally, Altmer are extremely superficial and really care about looks, and more specifically how elvish one looks. More human qualities in outward appearance are deemed less attractive, and in very conservative Altmer circles, just having some human genes from a far-off human ancestor is already problematic. One of the greatest qualities to have for traditional Altmer is very sharp ears, because sharper ears signify less human ancestors. But not just that, I mean, sharp facial features are considered attractive because humans tend to have more rounded faces. Height is also one of these features. High elves tend to be taller than humans, thus the taller one is, the more attractive that they are considered to be. And finally, more yellowish golden skin is also considered to be the most attractive, as human ancestors cause for either lighter or darker skin, which is considered less attractive in most conservative Altmer circles. But it's not just important not to have human qualities. Symmetry of the face is also very important to many, as is symmetrical bone structure, the right width between the eyes, nose not being too big, not too large. In general, very average facial features seem to be important, and almond is considered to be the very best eye color, as green, blue, brown, etc. are all considered to be the result of human or other racial ancestors. And beards with the High Elves are generally a no-go in conservative circles, save for extremely well-kept short beards or moustaches for older men. Basically anything dirty or considered brutish is considered to be too human-like and thus not really considered attractive. Because of these really superficial standards, far stricter than any other race or culture, face sculpting magic and face sculptors using it are actually quite common in the Somerset Isles, as people will use magic to adhere to the beauty standards. Now, it's important to note here that we know that these things come from very conservative Altmer circles. It's likely that most not too conservative Altmer appreciate some of these qualities, sure, but don't really adhere to them very strictly and may find other things attractive as well. We don't really know how much of the High Elf population at this point is still that conservative, but it's a section of the population that we just know most about. So be sure to take these standards with a bit of a grain of salt, as in less conservative Altmer circles it's definitely not that strict most likely. That being said, the final 2 races that we do need to talk about are the beast races, and let's start with the Khajiit. Interestingly enough, since there are so many types of Khajiit, or fur stocks as they call it themselves, a video on that is in the description if you haven't seen it, it seems that there aren't really any body types or fur patterns which are considered especially attractive in Khajiiti culture, likely because there are so many different ones. That being said, there are a few universal rules for Khajiit attractiveness, it seems to be, some of which I personally find to be pretty hilarious. A great example is of how straight and unbroken whiskers are one of the sexiest things for a Khajiit apparently. Khajiit take this very seriously, I mean very seriously. Some of them even use little clips to bind their whiskers to bamboo twigs while they sleep, so their whiskers don't wrinkle in their sleep. Good stuff. Other than that, they have a saying, claws make the cat, meaning that their claws need to be polished, neatly trimmed and sharp to boot. Now, the Khajiit ideal is smooth and unknitted fur, which appears sleek and shiny to the eye. Because of this, there are many fur products to make their fur shine and fur brushes to untangle knits in the fur, as knitted fur seems to be a signal of being untidy and slobbish. Now, a final thing to note about Khajiit beauty standards is that green eyes are apparently considered to be especially attractive, as they are quite rare. Now, finally, we have the Argonians, who are an interesting case, as one of the things that the Argonians seem to appreciate is a strong smell. While the other races have all kinds of perfumes to mask any smells, Argonians seem to find it attractive in some cases, which is interesting. Now, something else which the Argonians really appreciate are sharp and shiny horns on their head. We have some items which suggest that they both regularly sharpen and wax their horns, but in terms of wax, it's not just their horns, because they apparently also wax their scales, as clean and shiny scales are considered to be very attractive to many Argonians. And one funny little tidbit is that some of the chemicals that they use to clean their scales can actually burn the skin of other races or cause extreme rashes, so yeah, do with that knowledge what you want. Now, unlike most other races, smooth skin is actually not that attractive, as skin ridges and wrinkles are considered to be very nice to look at in Argonian society. Now, having talked about all the races, I have to admit that this is not a full picture, but it's basically everything we know in terms of confirmed lore, at least what I could find after 30 hours of research on the log. I mean, what I found is not that much, but it's quite interesting nonetheless, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed learning about it, as this is just all there is, seemingly. So that having been said, let's now talk about a quite different topic once more. Drugs. So first of all, the most well-known drug of Tamriel, skooma. We know that skooma is the favorite drug of Tamriel, and that there are a lot of skooma addicts across Tamriel. But what exactly is skooma? Skooma is a drug manufactured using refined moon sugar. It's extremely addictive and gets users all sorts of hallucinations, actually cause severe mental issues for the user. We know that the drug is made out of moon sugar, a bit of nightshade and some quite flammable substance we don't actually know the name of. However, in Skyrim we can see a far more potent version of skooma, called red water skooma. It can be made using water from the blood spring, and it was actually used in the 4th era by some vampires to get addicts on a high so they could steal their blood with less resistance. There are also other forms of skooma found in Skyrim, one of which we will touch on later in this video. To consume skooma, one can smoke it with a special skooma pipe when it's been watered down a little. Or one can drink it in its pure liquid form, which is way stronger but has a less long use. It has been banned by most governments throughout the ages, but this has not stopped people from using it, since skooma has a large active smuggling network. One of the specific smuggle routes is between the city-state of Daggerfall in High Rock and the city of Vivec in Morrowind, which is actually also one of the longest roads you can travel on in the Elder Scrolls, if you would have an actual open Tamriel. We can actually see some drug dens in Skyrim in action and smuggling operations in action in Riften, Whiterun and some other places. For a lot of people, skooma smuggling and selling is a very lucrative business that has made a lot of people in lore very rich. It has been said that the Dark Elves created skooma long ago, but throughout history it's been most important to the Khajiit, since it has become ingrained in some of their rituals, in which it's used and controlled by the Moon Bishops. Skooma addiction has become a real menace within Khajiit culture, based on this ingrainment in culture. We know that it is really hard to withdraw from skooma addiction, as witnessed by Jadar in Skyrim. It can cause bad paranoid hallucinations and can cause real violence. Some say skooma addiction is very uncurable, but we have seen some great examples of skooma curings, even through the simple means of just a healing potion in Skyrim. This means that whether the addiction can be cured or not is dependent on some factor we don't really know of. It could be one's character, one's physical strength, but also, for example, race. We know that Khajiit can handle a lot more skooma before getting addicted compared to other races, which actually causes for more addiction in Khajiiti culture, since they think, hey, we can handle more. So second, let's talk about sleeping tree sap, a drug that, for the time being, seems to be legal within the Empire and also within an independent Skyrim, if that's the choice you made in the Civil War. This sap is actually one of the strongest narcotics in the game, taken from the sleeping tree in the Whiterun Plains. Whether there are more of these trees in Tamriel is very unknown, but I think that if there are very few, and this substance is very rare and very expensive, and very hard to come by. Plus, I think its legality mostly comes from the fact that it's less well known than skooma, and not fully in the sight of any government yet. Another part of it seems to be that it does not alter your mood or emotions, all it does is make you feel healthier and drowsy, and makes you a bit slow. It's closer to something like aspirin or morphine, and not really closer to a hard drug like skooma, which also causes changes in character. Some say that the sleeping tree, that actually is the origin of all the sleeping tree sap, might be an offspring of a hist tree, or one of the histories or hist-like trees from the city of Umbriel. But others say that it originated out of the eruption of the Red Mountain. Depending on the story you believe, this sap could actually be a strain of hist sap. But for that to be true, the Argonians would have to be less susceptible to its effects, and that's not necessarily the case in Skyrim for as far as I know. So I doubt that it's his sap, but it could be another strain which also affects Argonians. Who knows, it might be. The conclusive answer is that we don't know what it is exactly. Other than its origins, we don't know its exact functions. Another drug that is less well known is a skooma-like substance that's called Balmora Blue. We encountered this drug only once, during Skyrim's Thieves Guild questline. We know that it's a drug that is banned, and that it's based on alcohol and moon sugar. The moon sugar of which causes the skooma-like effect. It only gets made in the city of Balmora and thus is very rare outside of that city. Even rarer outside of Morrowind. So in like a province like Skyrim, or even further away, a province like High Rock, it is nearly impossible to come by. Next we go to the Forest of Valenwood. There are local bosmer there that have a drug called Bucksmoke, which gives the user a very exhilarated feeling. This is however a very peculiar drug, as it is not made of any plants. Due to the Green Pact that forbids the plant consumption for bosmer that follows it, they had to find another drug. So this drug is instead not made out of plants, but made out of bugs, like caterpillars and little grubs, and then they smoke it from their bone pipes. It's no wonder that you actually rarely see this drug outside of Valenwood, since nobody actually wants to do this, and it's a quite primitive drug. But unless you have no other choice for it, like the bosmer following the Green Pact, you can of course use it. Next we have an Argonian drug we know almost nothing about, and it appears not that often in the franchise. It's called Darryl. It only appears a couple of times within the Elder Scrolls franchise, in the novels and in Elder Scrolls Online. In Elder Scrolls Online it's involved in an apothecary quest, but in the novel we get a little more info. It turns out that Darryl, in the Argonian language, literally means seeing everything in ecstasy. The drug comes from a snake the Argonians called the Moon Adder. Its venom kills everything, except for Argonians. Argonians can survive a bite, and when its bite injects the Darryl, it usually kills all, but the Argonians do not get killed and get weird visions that cause them to see everything in ecstasy. Which is why some of the Argonians actually seek their snakes out for pleasure. It's a drug that, after consumed, unfolds in stages. All stages of the drug are very different. And in certain stages it confuses the senses, like getting hallucinating sounds. But also you apparently see sounds, hear tastes, smell sights. It's a really weird drug that does all kind of things to your senses. And it kills everyone, but due to a certain agent in the Argonian blood, they can actually sustain it. If heavily worked upon, the venom can actually be used to create another drug we know even less about. And we don't even know a full name for the drug. It's said that this drug is used by the elites in their ancient banquets during the dinner. Because they can make it so that it only affects taste and not the other senses. But again, we all know almost nothing about it. Now I know that this video is called The Drugs of Tamriel, but I feel like 2 drugs from the Oblivion realm of Shivering Isles actually deserve a short mention, as they can be taken from there to Tamriel. First of all, there's Feldew. It's poisonous and it's a substance that's very addicting to the user. It's produced in the bodies of a large insect called elytras that live in the Shivering Isles and create a lot of euphoria in the user when used. However, this euphoria is short-lived and creates for huge withdrawal effects. This causes for people to have to keep consuming it, not to fall back on those withdrawal effects, hence the addictiveness. The second drug is called Green Mode, which is basically another very powerful substance in the form of a powder from the Shivering Isles. It's produced in the saplings of mushroom trees and as its unrefined form, but if refined, it's even more powerful. In overdoses it can lead to even explosion of the heart, but in small doses it can actually be quite useful, as it causes rapture, which can cause for improved night vision, speed and endurance, but it also has its down effects. Later, after the use, you get blurry vision, decrease in intelligence, strength and speed.
Alright, now having talked about drugs, let's talk about something even more interesting. Trees. Or at least some particularly interesting trees. I'm not talking about regular trees here.
So, trees. Most of us know what they are about. Big brown stems, leaves on the twigs that come from it. Usually I have to explain things on this channel, but I don't think I have to explain this one. That said, Tamriel has its own fair share of trees, and today I want to talk about them. I specifically want to talk about some Tamriel exclusive trees, because a lot of the trees that we see in real life, like oaks, birch trees, pine trees and even sycamores, are actually also present on Tamriel. While a plant biologist would likely disagree, I don't think it's too interesting to talk about those kind of trees in an Elder Scrolls Lore video, so I'll only be talking about the trees exclusive to Tamriel. Now, one of the first types of trees that I actually want to talk about are ironwood trees. While we do have trees in our universe that are nicknamed ironwood trees, it seems that these specific ones are Tamriel exclusive, so I'll talk about them as the first option before going to the real exclusives. These are trees which have existed in the lore since Daggerfall, but which have been a bit neglected by the games. Let me explain. Ironwood trees are extremely sturdy trees which produce wood almost as strong and unbreakable as iron. In the early Daggerfall/Morrowind lore, Skyrim used to have quite a few groves of these trees deep within its forest, but in-game we do not see them anymore anywhere. With the exception being the Oblivion Creation Kit and one of Skyrim's creations from the Creation Club, which brings them into the game. Now, Creation Club content is highly dubious in its canonicity, but since it's all we have and I kind of like the explanation that they offer, I'll tell you what's in there. In that creation they add the lore that these trees once used to be quite prevalent in Skyrim, but that they almost went extinct due to harvestation for both its wood, which is extremely strong, and its nuts and its fruit, which both hold quite useful alchemical properties for combat and medicine. Therefore, human greed made all of these ironwood trees disappear from Skyrim's landscape, except from the furthest reaches away from the mortals, where no humans come, like the island where we go to during the Creation Club quest, where you find some ironwood trees. I'm sorry for the very bad screenshot, I only have this creation on my Nintendo Switch, because I couldn't be bothered to buy Creation Club content on any other platform. That said, this type of tree has several different variants. You have regular ironwood, black ironwood, which is supposed to be stronger than regular ironwood, and you have orange ironwood, which comes from a variant of the tree that's reportedly growing sparsely in elsewhere in Valenwood as opposed to Skyrim. Now, next up is the first real exclusive, like there's no version of this in our own universe, which are the great Grot Oak trees of Valenwood, which may just be the biggest trees to exist on Tamriel. There are colossal trees dotting Valenwood in which the Bosmer grow their cities. You see, due to the Green Pact, the Bosmer cannot harm the trees of Valenwood in any way, so they can't harvest them for plants. Rather, the Bosmer use magic to shape the trees in ways which allows them to live in the trees, often shaping them like houses. The Grot Oaks, due to their massive size, have essentially become the base ground for the largest Bosmer cities. Some, like the large Elden tree of the Sea of Eldenroot, are shaped to grow hollow, so the entire inside of the tree can be used as one enormous Bosmer city. But there's also a lot that we don't know about these Grot Oaks, as there's quite some mystery to them. Some can move themselves, like the Grot Oak of the city of Falanesti, Because that city is based in a large moving tree, that city basically tracks around Valenwood as their tree walks, or rather moves, around the Valenwood forests, although how exactly we don't really know. Other Grot Oaks have even been known to be able to talk and have intelligent conversations. Their branches often hold massive animal colonies next to the bosmer who live in them, and some of them have such gigantic green canopies that it completely blots out the sky for a large area under it, causing some to call Grot Oak canopies a second sky, or the middle green. Now, the next type of tree I want to talk about is the Witch Tree, which only appears in one game, the Elder Scrolls Travel Shadowkey, a very obscure Elder Scrolls game. I actually covered the main story of that game in one of my older videos, which is in the description if you want to see it, because despite the lacking narration, it's still one of my better videos. This tree, which is located in Western Hammerfell, is sentient and speaks to the player and gives quests to help the local population by conveying its meanings through the movements of its roots and the rustling of its leaves. Which, if you look at this image, it strangely doesn't have any leaves, but it apparently still uses leaves to communicate, so just take that one. Now, the interesting thing is that we don't exactly know how this tree has become sentient. It could be a Grot Oak, which was maybe planted by the Bosmer a long time ago. It could also be one of the Hist, which are the sentient trees which created the Argonians as their servants. Or it could be that this tree is possessed by some sort of spirit. I personally think it's the last case, as this tree looks absolutely nothing like one of the Hist trees, which I'll talk about briefly later in this video. But as you can see in the image, it looks absolutely nothing like a Hist tree. Now, the reason I think it's likely some sort of spirit which possesses the tree is that we have another case of a tree possessed by a spirit, which I think is worth discussing together with the witch tree so you can see the similarities. Namely, we have the Beldama Weird tree in High Rock. This tree is basically a really large oak tree, which is either possessed by a spirit that people call the Weird Spirit, or the tree is the physical form of that spirit, which they call the Weird Spirit. Whichever is the case, this large tree, which is tended to by Beldama Weird Sisters, quote-unquote, glows with an unnatural light and gives life to the land around it and supposedly has some form of control over other planets in the area. And it has elemental spirits bound to it, which the tree uses to communicate with the sisters which care for it in order to guide them. This very much sounds like a bigger and stronger version of the witch tree from Shadowkey, as that tree also cared about the area around the tree and cared for it by having the hero of the game help the local population in its quests. This is kind of unlike the Hist, which tend to be more apathetic, although not always, and generally only care for Argonians, although there are again some exceptions to that. But therefore I think it's more likely that it's a bit of a similar case to the Weird tree. Something interesting, by the way, one of the sources for this video on the Weird Tree is actually an Imperial missive on Glanumbra, which is like the region where the Weird Tree is in. Basically, that missive says that the people living close to the Weird Tree care so much about the forests around the Weird Tree that if the Imperials ever want to invade High Rock and occupy the place, they should just threaten the people with deforestation in order to bully the local population into submission. Yeah, fun stuff. Now, I personally think that the Eldergleam tree and the Gildergreen tree that we see in Skyrim are in a similar situation, but they likely have far weaker spirits in them, as they are also said to be sentient in some ways. Now, the Eldergleam is said to be the oldest tree in all of Skyrim, which was planted from a sapling that the early Needs brought from the continent of Admora during the Great Migration from humans to Tamriel from Admora. It's a tree which is so large and so strong that some have theorized that this was actually one of the Ironwood trees, because normal weapons actually can't harm it. But those theories are all from before the Creation Club, because the Creation Club gave us a look at some actual Ironwood trees which looked far more like the ones that are present in the Oblivion Creation Kit. So I personally think that the Eldergleam, along with its offspring Whiterun's Gildergreen tree, are most likely also possessed by spirits in some way, just like the Weird tree and the Witch tree. Or they are the physical form of certain spirits, although there are very little pieces of lore on those trees, so we really don't know what their story is. I just grouped them with those two, since their situations seem to be somewhat similar, be it not completely comparable. So let me know your own theories on these trees if you have them. Now, the next type of tree which I'll discuss is a bit less mysterious, but definitely not less interesting. It's the Briarheart tree. Now, we know Briarheart warriors from Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls Online. They are warriors that had their hearts torn out in a ritual and replaced with a Briarheart fruit, which can act as a replacement heart when placed by Haggraven magic. This fruit, placed in their chests, gives them an enhanced hearing and greater stamina and strength. While quite a lugubre and interesting ritual, which causes this whole heart transplant thing, the tree which produces the Briarheart fruit is almost equally as interesting, because in order to grow one of these Briarheart trees, one needs to plant a seed in a plot of soil inside a corpse which was purified by a Haggraven and is dumped into the ground. The planting of the seed into that body is apparently a secret but very elaborate ritual. Then the planted seed needs to be taken care for with spells and regular waterings with blood, and then the tree will start slowly growing from the body. First, several sprouts will come out of the body and then connect together into a larger tree as the tree's roots. Very early in a tree's life, even as a sapling, it will carry Briarheart fruits, which can be picked in order to transplant them into the bodies of willing warriors, or maybe even unwilling ones. We don't really know too much about that ritual either, although we do know a little bit more than about the ritual for the seed planting. But that's quite interesting, at least in my opinion. Now, next we have two types of tree which appear in Skyrim, which we don't really know an awful lot about. We've got the Sleeping Tree, which is a weird white purplish tree growing on Whiterun's plains, the sap of which has an intoxicating effect which is considered a drug. Now, this tree supposedly either came from the floating island Umbriel from the Elder Scrolls novels, which would make this sleeping tree one of the Hist, or at least a sort of Hist tree, or another theory states that it came from the Red Mountain and a tiny part of the heart of Lorkhan's power persists in the tree as it grew from a rock thrown out of the Red Mountain during its eruption in the Red Year. But we don't really know exactly which theory is right. I'm personally leaning more towards the Red Mountain theory, as the tree looks nothing like a history which we see in the Elder Scrolls Online and in some concept art. But on the other hand, the histories of Umbriel seem not to be the exact same ones as we have on Tamriel, so if you read the novels, you don't know, there's no real conclusion that we can base on this one. But it doesn't completely invalidate that theory, because those Hist were different. So again, let me know what your theory is. I might actually do a video on the Umbriel crisis soon. Or I might not. Let me know if you want that. Anyway, the other three that we have from Skyrim, which we don't know an awful lot about, are the so-called canticle trees. These pink leaf trees are very rare and only grow in very specific places, which the moth priest order calls ancestor glades. These trees attract ancestor moths, which are moths with strange mystical properties, which are used in ancient moth priest rituals, among which are primitive Elder Scrolls readings. We can actually find some of these moths in the Dawnguard questline in Skyrim, where the moths help us read some of the Elder Scrolls. Now, three final mentions are the Fabricant trees, Nightwood trees, and regular trees, which, well, they glow. First, Fabricant trees are synthetic trees that exist within Sothasil's clockwork realm. They stand in metallic soil of the clockwork city, and they are essentially just decorative plants, as they resemble all kind of regular trees found around Tamriel. But they aren't alive, because they are just decorations. And then there are the regular trees that glow. They are exactly what you think. Regular trees which just glow. Oak trees which, for example, just have leaves that glow. They exist on Tamriel, and it's unclear to me whether they are the result of magic from mortals or whether they grow as a glowing tree. To be honest, we don't really have lore on it. Now, on the Nightwood trees, we also don't have a lot of lore. Actually, we have very little, because Nightwood is a material from the Elder Scrolls Online which, well, we just absolutely have no lore on. In one of the Lore Masters archives, they basically joked around with the first sighting of Nightwood being when a Khajiit stole some wood at night, but I don't really see that as a very reliable source, to be honest. I think that's more of a joke with the unreliable narrator part. It's far more likely that Nightwood is just wood from Cold Harbor, so from Molag Bal's Daedric realm, because it's purple with like a blue glow, just like Cold Harbor. And we can find it there in some cases, but some people have speculated it might be something from Tamriel, which I think is unlikely, but it's worth a mention. Right, and then I promised I'd talk about the histories. Well, I'm planning to do a video on them, or rather a new video, since one of my first ever videos on this channel was on the histories, and that video wasn't too great. So yeah, you could watch that video, but in case you don't want to listen to badly presented lore, or at least worse than now, and a bad microphone, and you also can't wait for the actual remaster of that video. In short, his trees are sentient trees which have been around basically ever since the very earliest times on Tamriel, from even before the earliest Elnofey wars, in which they were just a bystander, and their large forest used to cover all of southern Tamriel. And those forests were largely destroyed during the Elnofey wars, as they were just an innocent bystander in those wars. They are extremely powerful as a collective, and they communicate with each other across their forest, with their roots. When their forests were largely destroyed by the Elnofey wars, they used their powers to create the Argonians as their caretakers and protectors, to protect the histories against the wars and destructions of mortals. They speak to the Argonians in many ways, from rustling leaves to wind chimes to even giving direct visions, and they can even influence the Argonians' very physique during their birth and lives. Their sap sustains both the Argonians unborn and when they are born, because after their birth they drink his sap in order to shape the Argonians and allow them to connect properly to the Hist. Having said that, this by far does not cover everything about the Hist. They are simply not just a type of tree. They are far more important than that, and a mention in a list-like video like this would do them just a complete disservice. So, just like my original video did them a complete disservice. So I'll likely make a video on them somewhere later this year.
That being said, that's basically all I can tell you about the mildly interesting, not too interesting, trees on Tamriel. Now let's talk about something else. The history of the Sweetroll, everybody's favorite little dessert on Tamriel. Or snack, I don't judge you if you eat them before 5.
So, the Sweetroll, a tasty little treat that is the most famous treat and an undisputed favorite treat of many people across Tamriel. The treat itself consists out of a small baked cake with icing on top. Quite simple, but yet the long taffy treat, sugar treats and all types of breakfast, lunch, dinner or dessert dishes really pale in comparison to the Sweetroll to many people on Tamriel. This simple, cake-like treat is the absolute king of Tamrielic cuisine to a large part of Tamriel's population. And it's been that way for ages, as references to the Sweetroll can be found in text from the early Second Era, but its exact history isn't quite clear to us unfortunately, nor is its origins, as we usually only find references in text to how tasty the Sweetroll is and not to anything specific as to its origin. This means that the Sweetroll could be much older than the beginning of the Second Era. If I'd have to speculate, and then I really mean speculate, because there's no real grounds for any official history or official speculation on the matter, I'd say that the Sweetroll's history is likely similar to that of the cupcake in our real world. The cupcake most likely came to be as a small cake for handing out to people, baking small cakes separately to avoid having to cut a larger cake and thus shorten the baking process by decreasing the volume of the individual cakes and giving the ability to bake multiple at once due to their size. It's quite likely that the Sweetroll came to be in a similar fashion, where there was probably some form of cake with icing which people really liked, and then for example at a festival or something, someone started baking smaller versions of the cake for a handout, and that just caught on. Most likely the Sweetroll came to be in one of the bigger cities, or at least rose to prominence in one of the bigger cities on Tamriel. Maybe during an event or something, where there were some guests from all over Tamriel that attended, thus explaining the quick spread of the Sweetroll over Tamriel, as these guests would have taken them home, or at least would have taken the idea of a Sweetroll home. But keep in mind that all this history that I just told you could be completely bogus, as we know nothing of the Sweetroll's origin, it's simply speculation. You know, people often ask me to speculate more on things on this channel that really matter, and well, can't say that I didn't. But you know, this speculation of history is kind of based on something, as making Sweetrolls is kind of similar to making cupcakes, and thus I suspect that their history could be linked, or at least somewhat similar. You see, via the official Elder Scrolls cookbook we learn that the Sweetroll is made by creating a dough mix consisting of butter, milk and honey, to which salt, yeast, egg and flour is added. Since these ingredients exist in both the Elder Scrolls universe and our own universe, I think the ingredients in the Elder Scrolls universe are likely the same as those in the real world variant from the official Elder Scrolls cookbook. Anyway, that mix needs to be poured into smaller shapes for baking, similar to how cupcake dough is also poured into smaller shapes for baking. From the Elder Scrolls Online we know that this process is executed by using a special Sweetroll pastry pan that professional bakers have. These pans have smaller sections to pour dough in and then bake the individual Sweetrolls in an oven. And then once the baking is done, you'll have to pour the icing over the Sweetrolls, which is made out of cream, some cheese, butter and powdered sugar. This is the recipe for a regular sweet roll, and as you probably deduced, the dough and the icing can also be used to make bigger sweet roll cakes, hence my speculation that it probably came from bigger cakes and then they just made smaller ones for handouts. Over the years we've seen two variants of the sweet roll. One in Oblivion, as you can see, they appear as some sort of cupcakes, while in Skyrim, Blades and Legends they appear as the sweet rolls that we all know and love. Meanwhile, in the Elder Scrolls Online, in the second era, we see both variants existing at the same time, the cupcake one and the regular sweet roll one. Meaning that there's likely multiple variations of sweet rolls. Perhaps there are even regional variants, for example Hammerfell spiced ones, or one from Valenwood which has all sorts of meat in it according to the Green Pact. But if such variants exist, we don't really have any documentation of them existing in the canon at the moment. Except for this one, which we got on Valentine's Day or Heart's Day in the Elder Scrolls Legends, which is now also a canon form of sweet roll, so confirming the multiple types of sweet rolls. How exactly such a simple dish has led to an almost cult-like status, I have no idea, but people have literally become addicted to sweet rolls to a point where some would apparently die without one, and some people would literally beat up others in order to steal their sweet rolls for their own consumption. Of course, this has become somewhat of a running gag in the series of people stealing other people's sweet rolls, but still, if it's more than a joke, it could point to a systemic problem. Sweet rolls were even used during the Second Era as a calling card by a mysterious murderer in Kvatch called the Sweet Roll Killer. This killer would bake threatening notes into sweet rolls and have them delivered to future victims, marking them for death. It's also one of the more interesting quests in the game, so play that quest, the Sweet Roll Killer, if you want a good mystery quest. Anyway, back to the sweet roll itself. Something else that we know is that the sweet roll, when baked by a baker and gets handed out to people, it gets packed in some form of paper. I honestly didn't know where to leave this in the script, but it's canon lore, so we're putting it in. What's clear is that the sweet roll has almost cult-like status. Crystal figurines are made of sweet rolls, small totems carved out of wood, and even adoring songs, one of which is the Liturgy of the Holy Sweet Roll, which we can find in the Elder Scrolls Online. I won't bore you with the entire song because I can't sing, and I won't sing in this video, but the first verse goes like this. All hail the Holy Sweet Roll, fluffy, gooey, warm and sweet. All hail the Holy Sweet Roll, all hail this delicious treat. And then you have 4 more verses like that. So yeah, if that isn't obsession, I don't really know what is. Anyway, that's literally all the confirmed lore and my own speculation that I could do upon the confirmed lore on the sweet roll. Alright, now from the sweet roll, let's talk about quite a different topic once more. The fairy tales and fables of Tamriel. So, fairy tales and fables. Usually short stories made for children, which in our world usually involve magic or mythical creatures. They often contain a message or moral to the story, such as listen to your elders, be nice to people, or think before you act. Those kind of morals. They are mostly told to children, sometimes as bedtime stories or as cautionary tales. Some spawn a massive following and then enter the mainstream, like for example the story of Little Red Riding Hood in our universe, which basically is adapted everywhere, while others remain as local and obscure folk tales told to children. Sometimes they are stories which are just thought up by parents or storytellers meant to convey the moral of the story, and sometimes there are stories which originate out of local legends or outlandish sightings in the past. Needless to say, fairy tales come in all kinds of shapes and forms. And it's really no different on Tamriel, with some fairy tales that we have on Tamriel designed as cautionary tales, others as bedtime stories or a mix of both, or local legends adapted to a story, or even historical events which are wildly exaggerated for children. But the interesting thing is that unlike in our world, many of the mythical creatures which appear in our fairy tales, well, they actually exist in the Elder Scrolls universe, creating an interesting situation where many fairy tales in Tamriel are actually based on actually existing creatures instead of some creature from mythology which doesn't actually exist in our universe. A good example of this is the unicorn, like we talked about in my recent video on the creature, link in the description if you want to know more. The unicorn is actually a Daedric creature in the Elder Scrolls universe, created by the Daedric prince of the hunt, Hircine, as the ultimate hunting prey, and as such is very rarely taken to Tamriel by the Daedric prince to serve as sort of legendary prey for his hunts in the forest of Tamriel. As such, some hunters in the woods have told their neighbors back in town that they saw a unicorn in the woods being chased by evil Daedra, making the people think that the unicorn is some sort of magical enemy to the Daedra, but they lack the context and knowledge that the unicorn is actually just a Daedric creation created for sport by the Daedric prince. As such, many folk stories and fairy tales on Tamriel have been created by the population, where they see the unicorn as the sort of idol of all that is good, an enemy of the Daedra and protector of mortals. While that isn't the truth, they are just fairy tales born out of local folk legend of those hunters witnessing Hircine's hunts. They are a creation of the Elder Scrolls' unreliable narrator theme, where the locals have created folktales out of barely understood sightings that actually happened. Now, another way that the people of Tamriel, and us in the real world too by the way, create fairy tales is by creating sensationalized stories for children to explain misunderstood historical phenomenons, such as the disappearance of the dragons and the existence of dragon frogs, which I also talked about in detail recently in a video on the dragon frog. A link to that video is also in the description. Anyway, to the people of Tamriel, the dragons mysteriously disappeared in a bygone age. They've always become these mythical creatures that most people don't really believe exist, or existed. But these frogs with dragon-like wings do exist all over southern Tamriel, so many children's stories or fairy tales have sprung up where adults make up fun fairy tales for children, explaining away the disappearance of the dragons by evolving these dragon frogs, by saying that the dragons evolved into them, sometimes involving the gods or a treacherous Daedric prince into the stories who either trick the dragons or the frogs, bringing a moral into the story for children. But another concrete example of these kinds of stories that we have is the Argonians' children's story of How the Hackwing Got Her Tail, which is a children's fairy tale of a talking hackwing getting its short tail straightened because of a bog dog who stretched it. So, yeah. Now, another example of this is how very little Dunmer actually accurately remember why their skin turned ashen, while at first it was gold when they were the Chimer. This part of history has also been turned into many fables for children, apparently to explain away their ashen skin and red eyes, although we don't actually have any of those stories, it's just told to us that those stories exist. Anyway, we see these two types of stories, misunderstood or misremembered history going into legend and thus fairy tale, and wrongly explained local sightings being translated into fairy tales quite a lot. While we have some examples of stories like this, such as the dragon frogs being tricked by Peryite, we don't get a lot of concrete stories like it, but we very often hear stuff like, oh, that's just a fairy tale, or oh, we just tell that to children before bed, whenever we are about to go delve into some ancient mystery in any of the games. So we know that a lot of fairy tales exist, but like I said, we don't get a lot of concrete written out for us. But some stories, which, at least in my opinion, are especially interesting in our universe, are those which contain fictional mythical creatures, which obviously don't exist in real life. Think about unicorns in our universe, for example. As we established, this works a bit different in the Elder Scrolls universe, since most of the creatures do exist and most stories are based on some form of truth in the Elder Scrolls universe, like the High Elf fairy tales of the Scary Sload, which of course straight up exist. We even fight some in the Elder Scrolls Online. But there are some creatures which do not actually exist on Tamriel, but do exist in the fictional children's stories on Tamriel. So a fictional animal in what for us is a fictional universe. One such example is the Phoenix. We have the Phoenix mentioned a few times, such as the birth legend of Selhinwe, the Griffin, in the name of some insects, in a rhyme in Daggerfall, and in some item descriptions. However, it seems like the creature does not actually exist on Tamriel, and that the Phoenix is just a fictional creation for children's stories. We have some more examples of this, like the Sphinx, which is supposed to be an elsewhere myth, and a traditional mermaid as we know them in our universe. I mean, we of course have nereids and nymphs in the Elder Scrolls universe, but no traditional mermaids, despite them being mentioned in some short stories. There are more examples like this of fictional creatures which don't exist but are mentioned in stories. However, for some it's really hard to tell whether or not they once might have existed in Tamriel, since Tamriel's wildlife in lore, especially in the Merethic era, was far more diverse and at the same time is shrouded in unreliable narrators, so that we don't really know what's real and what wasn't real. Anyway, there is another type of story on Tamriel, which is the fictional story based on aspects of the world or creatures that are very much known to the people of Tamriel. A real world example of this would be the story of the rainbow fish. You know, the fish with the beautiful scales then gives them to all his mates until the shinies are evenly distributed among the workers, promoting communism. Okay, I clearly joke here, that story was part of my childhood, it was awesome, so I had to mention it somewhere in a story on children's stories, so there you go. Anyway, that story is based on stuff that we know. Fishes, the ocean, sea creatures, You know it. No real magic or mythical creatures, but we just assign some personalities and intelligence to these creatures that we do know, creating a story around it, giving it a moral, and done, you have a cool children's story. This also happens on Tamriel, with one of the best examples being the Dunmer children's story of the brave little Scrib. A Scrib, which is an infant form of the Kwama, a creature that isn't intelligent and can't speak, suddenly can speak and has a whole personality. Anyway, the Scrib in the story is called the Brave Little Scrib, and he's brave because he wants to play by the waterfall. Everybody in the Kwama colony, from the workers to the warrior Kwama, all warn him, don't do it, you will die because of water, you cannot swim. But the Scrib is like, water sounds good, so he goes to the waterfall anyway. It's only when he gets there and he encounters a torchbug who doesn't warn him, and rather just happily lets him jump into the waterfall, saying, "Oh man, I haven't seen a good drowning in a while. Those always entertain me. Please jump and drown for my entertainment." Only then does the Scrib decide, okay, maybe I shouldn't jump and die, so he goes back. Moral of the story, the adults know what they're talking about, maybe you should listen to them and don't be a dumb kid. And at the same time it also warns parents a bit that if they are overprotective and don't confront the children with the consequences directly, they'll only want to do it more. I kinda highlighted this story because it's really popular in Morrowind, with bards singing songs about the brave little Scrib, and even dolls of the little creature being made for kids. It's that popular over there. But we do have far more examples of fairy tales and fables based on the world that the people are confronted with. Most are a bit shorter. For example, in Morrowind you've also got the book Blessed Almalexia's Fables, a series of children's stories presumably written by or at the command of Almalexia for the children of Morrowind. The first story, The Tallest Shroom Beetle, reads like this. A shroom beetle, lamenting its small stature, crawled to the top of a great mushroom. It gazed out over the ashlands and cried, "Ha! There is no shroom beetle taller than I. There is nothing I cannot see." Just then, a cliff racer swooped down and plucked the beetle from its perch. The beast grinned a wide toothy grin and said, "Had you stayed on the ground, I would have never seen you. Is it not better to be short than dead?" Alas, the beetle learned too late that forsaking one's nature brings nothing but ruin. Yeah, each of these fables gives off lessons like this, which are either useful, like that which we may hate in ourselves can sometimes be our greatest gift, or mocking others is for naught, for none can change their own weakness, or we must be cautious with our calves, as smothering a child with praise does nothing but harm. And sometimes the lessons are even vaguely pro-tribunal propaganda, like there is no mortal strength without limits, but they are really just mostly stories which are useful for mortal children. But if you do want a fairy tale which is actually just tribunal propaganda, not just vaguely, there is a fairy tale of the Ruddy Man, some weird man or monster which eats people and cannot be stopped by normal dark elves, just by Lord Vivek. So yeah. Now, most of the races have these kinds of stories with popular characters, like the Bretons have short stories involving two characters called Crow and Raven. And the Breton Druids of the Sisters Archipelago also have a series of these kinds of stories involving their local wildlife and monsters, also conveying morals like nature is never predictable and even the smallest creature can fell a giant, tiny sparkles can create a wildfire, that kind of thing. Now, a final story of this type that I could find, which was pretty funny actually, was the story of the boy who became a Kaguti. Basically a dark elf fairy tale of a boy who wouldn't listen to anyone, was just stubborn all the time until a wizard transformed him into a Kaguti for eating his pie. Wild stuff. Now, moving on, another type of children's story that we can find on Tamriel are the tales of ancient heroes, either simplified or just completely made up for children. And also those glorifying past heroes, like the Redguard story of Sakin's Many Heroes, or the children's story of the Viridian Sentinel in High Rock, or a High Elf children's story about Topol the Pilot. There are also quite a lot of children's stories concerning creation myths. For example, we have of course the children's Anuat, which is a children's version of a creation myth, but we also have the Ooze fable of the Bosmer and Khajiit Cup tales. Now, a final thing I want to remark is that it isn't immediately apparent that some races or cultures have more or less children's stories or fairy tales than others. While we do have more lore books for the Dunmer than we have for any other culture, it doesn't seem like they have more stories than others in the lore, or at least it isn't immediately apparent, since the developers just chose to give us more stories of theirs in the games, because almost every part of Tamriel, they just bombard us with stuff like, "Oh, that's just a fairy tale we tell to children."
However, it may of course be very possible that the cultures with a big literary tradition, such as the Dunmer, the High Elves and the Imperials, have more children's stories and fairy tales than other races, but that isn't really all too clear in the sources that we have. That said, that's basically everything I can tell you about fairy tales and children's stories in the Elder Scrolls universe. Alright, now for our final two topics, let's talk about education on Tamriel, and then afterwards how university works on Tamriel.
Education in the Elder Scrolls universe is something we don't see an awful lot of in the games, and we might not always think about, likely for the obvious reason that it doesn't add to gameplay. However, it's an important part of the world and something that we can say some useful things about. First of all, we do get broad insights in specialized higher education in the Elder Scrolls universe. With specialized education I mean education in topics such as magic and bard education, with the Mages Guild universities, College of Winterhold and of course the Bards College in Solitude for bards. These are places where people get educated in specific professions, but also in other fields such as literature and writing in the case of the Bards College. There is also evidence for more types of higher education existing in the Elder Scrolls universe. Ever since Daggerfall, for example, we can find Introduction to Law Studies books, indicating that there is, or at least used to be, some formal education in law, for example for people to function within the bureaucracy of the kingdoms and the empire. Now, the most obvious place for higher education for academics is in the Elder Scrolls universe neither of those specialized institutions, but rather people would go to so-called schools of Julianos, the god of learning, wisdom and studying. I talked about these schools before in my video on Julianos, and they are essentially temples to Julianos, but instead of direct worship, the priests worship him through being an academic who pursue knowledge and create large libraries of collected knowledge. Students at these schools or temples learn no specific profession, but get educated in a broad sense in subjects such as logic, philosophy and math. This makes these schools of Julianos a thing that is most like an actual university in the Elder Scrolls universe. We haven't seen these specific schools in the games ever since Daggerfall, but we do know that they exist and are an important part of the world, as we know that they exist on all of Tamriel, not just the Iliac Bay region where Daggerfall takes place. Now, the curious part of all this is that these schools, just like the specific educational facilities we talked about earlier, are only accepting people who already have some form of basic education. They will not teach you to learn to read and write, they just actually treat it as a college or a university in lore. The schools of Juliano specifically state that we advocate literacy and education for all citizens of Tamriel, but our policy for those who wish to join the schools itself is very stringent. We have little time to waste to train the slow and lazy. So while they say they are advocates for basic education, the schools themselves do not cover this type of education. They don't teach children to read and write, but the big question is, who does then? The answer is never directly given to us, save for some offhand mentions. Now, in Bethesda's other series, Fallout, we actually have an actual children's school in Fallout 4 and Diamond City, but in Elder Scrolls, these kind of facilities for children are just completely missing from the games. So then the question is, where do children get educated? Now, while some might say, are children even formally educated? I'd say yes, because nearly everyone on Tamriel can read and write, something that's a specific skill that needs to be taught to an individual. Even peasants and poor farmers can read, and in some cases even beggars, because they write notes, have notes sent to them, and own books. Nearly every house on Tamriel has books. The literacy rate in the Elder Scrolls universe is astonishingly high. But how is that possible? In our own universe in the past, people's education would mostly be covered by whatever the parents knew, and sometimes their children would be educated by religious institutions or guilds if the parents could afford a religious institution or were part of a guild. Now, while our universe and the Elder Scrolls universe are not always comparable in terms of social history, in this specific case it might offer some clues, and they might be more comparable than some people would suggest. Because we know that in the Elder Scrolls universe, education, specifically literacy, gets covered by the parents for most parts, at least in the poorer families. We can learn this from several sources. A good example is the book Onus of the Ogma, where it specifically mentions that children learn to write in the Elder Scrolls universe by having to keep a journal, and that it's the parents who teach them to do this. In addition to that, we can find a note in Skyrim where the steward of Windhelm has sent a letter to Aventus Aretino, the orphan boy who starts the Dark Brotherhood questline. In this note, he specifically mentions that the steward doesn't know whether Aventus can read the note, as he doesn't know how much his dead mother was able to teach him in that regard. Meaning that reading and writing is the responsibility of the parents in the Elder Scrolls universe, and that the children mostly learn it through writing a journal in their daily life. So That's something I specifically found interesting, that they learn writing and reading through writing a journal. However, another interesting implication of the letter to Aventus Aretino is that it's this letter that informs him that he gets sent to an orphanage, which implies that the orphanage would have been responsible for his learning to read and write as well, if he didn't have those skills already when he arrived. Meaning that orphanages also have some responsibility to educate, and it's quite likely to assume that some villages also might have a sort of village elder who is too old to work, as for example a lumberjack or a blacksmith, and that a village elder may actually be responsible for the children's literacy in villages where the parents are mostly busy. What's interesting, however, is that it's not just the parents who educated children themselves, or these village elders. In the book Owners of the Ogma, it also specifically mentions teachers, and in Morrowind, Imperial NPCs actually brag about the high standard of literacy in the Empire due to the good education and schooling system in the Empire. While parents may be part of this equation in rural areas and less developed provinces like Skyrim, it's to be assumed from these dialogue that in lore there must be some form of central education in form of basic elementary schools in the larger cities or maybe larger important towns, where parents may be too busy with their own business to educate their children. It's also very possible that the Imperial government sort of subsidizes these schools and maybe even subsidizes guilds and religious organizations to found these schools and educate the children. As we for example know from a quest in Morrowind that the Mages Guild at least used to offer people literacy education because they wanted to make the Dunmer literate. Which would only be possible with funding from Imperial government, if this quote from Morrowind is true of course. Now, outside of the Empire, we know that other governments also educate the people through religious institutions. For example, we know that the Tribunal in Morrowind used their large religious apparatus, the Tribunal Temple, to educate the people of Morrowind and make them literate. We also know from the book The Argonian Account that there are schools of sorts for Argonian children to be educated in Tamrielic. And apparently these schools exist to reduce the crime rate in Argonia. I don't know, I found that funny. Now, basically that's everything that I could find on the topic. There's only a few sentences and things scattered around the world, but there's a lot more than I suspected than I would find, and not only that, the sources that I did find are all actually consistent at that, meaning that Bethesda did think about the topic.
Alright, now let's talk about university on Tamriel.
So, before we begin, I recommend watching my video on general education in the Elder Scrolls universe. It's an older video, so the narration isn't as good, but it goes into some of the lower education that any person on Tamriel receives. I'll just assume that you know the content of that video from now on, because this video goes purely into the universities and higher education. That video isn't fully accurate anymore though, but I'll go into some of the corrections regarding universities in this video, because the lower education parts of that video are still good, but some of the university parts need to be corrected, which was part of the reason for making this video. Anyway, time to start. So, like I said in my original video on education, we don't see a lot of the academic institutions in the game that we know exist in lore. That is because in the game world we usually only see that which is relevant to us as the player. This is probably because of the simple reason that it would be too much work to actually program in every little detail about the world into a game. But that doesn't mean that if a certain aspect of the world doesn't appear in the game that it doesn't exist in lore, because more than often it actually does. One of these kinds of topics is education and universities. A good example is how none of the games except the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall actually feature the Schools of Julianos, which is a sort of basic education system for the people of Tamriel, comparable to high schools. In my original education video I called these institutions universities, but upon new examination I have to say that the Schools of Julianos, which I talked about there, sound more like high schools or a very basic, broad higher education college, as the actual universities and academies that exist on Tamriel are far bigger than the individual Schools of Julianos and are established institutions on the continent, while the Schools of Julianos are basically just local schools. The actual academies, colleges and universities that we know of in the Elder Scrolls universe are very similar to their counterparts in our own world, in that they are mostly specialized institutions with very specific faculties or specializations. One goes there to be taught in a very specific field of choice, for example alchemy, history or magic of course. Because you see, just as we have universities specializing themselves in the study of specific areas around the world, think about physics, chemistry, biology, history, Tamriel has the exact same thing, but with magic being a big part of the world, it's logical that magic is also a very prominent field of study in the Elder Scrolls universe, just like physics is in our own universe. In a way, the magical universities are kind of the parallel of their physics counterparts in our own world, which is kind of interesting to think about, since our own universe is governed by the laws of physics that we study a lot, but there's a lot less attention for physics in the Elder Scrolls universe, since the laws of physics can basically be circumvented by force that isn't really present in our own universe: magic. Thus, because magic is so prominent and can bend the will of nature, we see a lot of magical universities, academies and colleges everywhere on Tamriel. I mean, why study physics when you can study that thing which can manipulate it? Good examples of such magical colleges are, of course, the Arcane University in the Imperial City, which we can see in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, the College of Winterhold in Skyrim, and the College of Sapiarchs in the Summerset Isles. But the College of Sapiarchs is actually a very good example of a more broad university in the Elder Scrolls universe, because not only does the College of Sapiarchs study the schools of magic, but the college also offers courses in far more subjects, 123 different fields of study to be precise, with examples such as alchemy, art, history, Daedric subjects, enchantment, food and wine studies, ocean studies, literature studies, and far, far more. They even have zoological studies where they study the animals of the continent. This university is by far one of the greatest institutions of learning on Tamriel, where a High Elf can study in whatever direction they want and that they are interested in. I would personally be very interested to see what their Daedric Fallacies course is like, but I digress. In order to enter the college, one must first do some sort of entrance exam to see if one is on the level required to tackle the topic studied at the college, which is similar to the other institutions that we know about on Tamriel, meaning that to get a higher education one must have either been private schooled or get the knowledge required to get higher education somehow. So that means that probably you have to have attended one of the schools of Julianos in order to have the knowledge to pass the entrance exams of the higher education forms on Tamriel, like the academies, colleges and universities. We also know that on the Summerset Isles there's a university in the city of Cloudrest. While we don't see it in any of the games, we know that it's there and that it has a faculty of surgery where advanced healing is taught. That said, not only the Altmer of Somerset have institutions which function as sort of universities, the Empire also has a few dozen institutions of its own, with some that we know a lot about and some which we only know their names of and nothing else. For example, we know that in the Imperial City there's the Imperial College, of which we know very little, and there's also an Imperial Academy of Alchemists and an Imperial Academy of Records and Histories. In addition to those, there is of course the Arcane University in the Imperial City that we saw in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, which was operated up until the end of the Third Era by the Mages Guild. Here they specialize in the courses of magic and of course in all its different schools and its intricacies. In the Fourth Era, the Arcane University is likely operated by either the Synod or the College of Whispers. We don't know exactly which of the two, since those factions haven't gotten a lot of lore. But we do know that these two Imperial institutions of magic also operate their own magical institutions around Tamriel where one can learn magic. So that's also a form of academies or universities. But next to the Arcane University there's also the Imperial University, which is a university that we don't see in any of the games, but has a wide range of study fields such as biology, history, law, theology and politics. We also know that the Imperial University actually have their own printing press, with them publishing their own books with the research from their most valued researchers and professors, with some of the most well-known being the Overview of Gods and Worship on Tamriel and the Notes on Racial Phalangy. And there's also from the Imperial University the Scholar's Guide to Nymphs, which we talked about in my previous video on the nymphs, which is in the description if you haven't seen it. One more academic institution that we know of in the Imperial City is the Imperial Geographical Society. I don't know if this is a university per se or just a collective of scholars, but they have existed since the Second Era and they're still in existence in the Fourth Era. They are the ones who produce the maps of Tamriel, and they make the Pocket Guide to the Empire series and the Emperor's Guide to Tamriel series, and they've also made some works on foreign lands such as the book The Marmor of Pianine. Skyrim also has its share of higher education institutions, with of course the College of Winterhold and the Bard's College in Solitude, with the Winterhold College focusing on schools of magic and the Bard's College focusing on poetry, literature and history studies. Now finally, there is one institution of higher learning that we know about and haven't yet talked about, which is the University of Gwyllym. We have a lot more lore on this specific university than most of the others combined, except for maybe the College of Sapiarchs, so I decided that we'll probably talk about the College of Sapiarchs in another video, since we have even more lore on that one. And then we'll get that one its own lore video somewhere down the line. So, the University of Gwylim. Like we talked about, there are on Tamriel several university-like institutions which offer history courses and make academic historical records in the form of books and scripts, for example like the Imperial University. But none has as many known published works in any of the games than the University of Gwylim. The existence of this university dates all the way back to the late First Era, and their printing press department has been responsible for numerous publications throughout Tamrielic history. The faculty of this university seems to have taken an interest in practical pedagogy, and sometimes they even offer training in illusion magic, which is also encouraged by its faculty. The university itself seems to have been located in Cyrodiil somewhere, but they also had a satellite campus in Skyrim Solitude for a while. The university mostly focuses on history in general and the preservation of Tamrielic history, with their history faculty being the most pronounced of all their faculties. Although they also seem to have anthropological studies, archaeology, biology and of course illusion magic and pedagogy like I mentioned before. We actually know that the university also awarded scholars with something called the Gwylim Prize, and this was likely for scholars who contributed to the university's reputation with an immense academic feat. The interesting thing here is that the university already existed in the lore since the earlier games, but in the Elder Scrolls Online we get offered a new and unique piece of perspective on the university with new pieces of information in regards to the lore that we already know. Now, while the rest of the lore on this university is basically as obscure as the others, we know a lot, and I mean a lot, of the scholars that were actually involved with this university. I think that it's worth to go through some of the scholars that worked for this university, since it gives them a bit of an insight into how university and how university research works in the Elder Scrolls universe. So, with that being said, let's talk about some of the people who made the University of Gwylim what it was. The founder of the University of Gwylim was called Chiran Fear, and it's implied that he was one of the most proficient sages of the entire university's history. His work centered itself around his own people, the Aelids, and that's what he was mostly known for, as he was an Aelid himself. His book on Aelid culture, called Nature of Aelidic Poesy, was published in the year 12 of the Second Era, and it presumably served as a very important study tool for the generation of scholars throughout the university in the upcoming centuries. His other works came in the form of unpublished biographies on the various Aelid kings of old, and one of these kings was King Narilmor of Garlas Malatar. With his works, Chiran Fear shed a very insightful light on the daily life of the Aelid people and their societies. When it comes to the Aelids, other works have also been published by this university, and one of these was a book on Aelid cities of Valenwood, which was written by a renowned historian called Humphrey in the year 455 of the Second Era. This book elaborated upon the Aelid settlements all around Valenwood, as the name of the book suggests. Frostras of Elenir also taught at this university, and his reputation was nearly unrivaled due to the work that he was known for. Some of the books he published were The Heartland of Cyrodiil, On the Nature of Cold Harbor, Introduction to the Adric Studies, and many more very informative books that gave much needed insight into the complex anthropological and religious climate of Tamriel. Unfortunately, Frostus was forced to flee back to Elenir, Hammerfell, sometime before the Alliance War in the year 580 of the Second Era, which forms, of course, the main quest of the Elder Scrolls Online. Another scholar at the University of Gwylim is Gabriel Belen, another famed magician and author. She was a student at the university before joining the Mages Guild during the Alliance War. She wrote books like Proposals, Scholars of Magic, Schemes of the Reach Mage, Non-Standard Techniques on Ardent Flame, Draconic or Endemic, and some other books on magic and specific fields of magic. Most of these books were written using the experience that she gained as a scholar at the university, and it assuredly helped mold her into a great academic, one of the great figureheads of the University of Gwylim. Now, the University of Gwylim also funded some academic expeditions, for example, an expedition conducted by the historian Reginus Bacca and the ancientist Farita Numidia to ruins of Skyreach in Craglorn in Hammerfell. Another famous, or rather infamous, publishing of the University of Gwylim are Maribor Sul's famous 11 volumes of the stories about the Dwemer, called The Ancient Tales of the Dwemer, and these books were originally presented as serious scholarly work based on the research from the archives of the Gwylim University. The publishing of these tales transpired in the year 670 of the Second Era, and at first these stories were viewed as factual, but scholars later debunked these texts, concluding that Maribor Sul was actually a pseudonym for Gor Falim, who was a very prolific writer at the time. Despite the fact that the surviving portions of Soul's work were identified as works of fiction, the university continued to publish them, which is why we can still find them in, for example, Skyrim. Then also published by the university was the famous book Opoluskes Lamebal ta Mesamorti. I'm not gonna try to even pronounce that again. This was a book actually written by a scribe called Mabai Ivanil, but it was translated by the University of Gwailin before its official publishing in the year 105 of the Third Era. This book offered a very dark yet needed perspective into the story of the origin of vampirism. To the people of Tamriel, what's written in the book is highly up for debate, but to us the viewers, we know that Molag Bal's vile nature comes very true in this book, and it opened us up to a very different and more brutal interpretation of vampiric conversion. As for other notable publications, the university itself published Frontier, Conquest and Accommodation, a social history of Cyrodiil in the year 344 of the Third Era. They also have several published works on other races, such as the goblins and other primitive beast folk, and this research mainly consisted of the distinguished Dr. Intricatus analyzing their primary weaponry and armor, which resulted in several academic papers on the beast folk and into goblins. Now, moving on to the unique piece of writing that actually embellished this university, this was the Gwailin Praxis, a rare book which was written by the Orate Serpent, and it goes into detail about the techniques that allow the draining of magicka from intelligent creatures at their moment of death. One can assume that the university was proud of this and that it added many mages to their studies, but we don't really know anything else about the Gwailin Praxis. Lastly, we know that the university itself had some sort of very prestigious antiquarian circle, literally called the Antiquarian Circle, and that this society scours the continent for lost antiquities and other collectibles in order to catalog them. This is how the antiquity system in the Elder Scrolls Online functions and has their own faction. This circle is actually made up of some of the historians that we talked about earlier, like Gabriel Belen and Reginus Bacca. Anyway, that's basically what we know about universities, the University of Gwailin, and all its academic scholars.
Alright, that was about all that I could say about University on Tamriel. That being said, I hope that you enjoyed this long 3-hour merge supercut video. I hope I didn't damage too many brains with this collection of mostly useless lore information, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I got quite some positive feedback on doing my first big lore collection video, where I merged several small topics on creatures and monsters together into one big bestiary, so here I did it again, except longer and with far more useless topics. Still, I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm going to work now on my next weekly lore video, which will be on the Elder Scrolls Online's Dark Brotherhood storyline. I hope to see you there if you enjoyed this video. That being said, I do release weekly lore videos, basically every week, smaller lore videos. Not all of them will receive this big compilation-like treatment. Some of them may in the future, but, you know, if you want to see everything my channel has to offer, please watch my standalone lore videos. They're the meat of this channel. Anyway, consider liking, subscribing, all that stuff to see, you know, nobody watches until this point. If you actually watched up until this point, let me know in the comments, maybe. I don't know. Tell me the number 7. If you put the number 7 in the comments, I know that you watched all the way up until this point. I can imagine that you're tired, just like me. Alright, see you in my next full lore video.